Hello and welcome to a brand new Unsourced Radio. I'm joined again by my good compatriots here, Comrade, Bullski, and Judge Anon. We've done this a couple of times before, just going on to talk about, some random comic BS, and today will be no different. I think it's going to be really fun tonight. I think Bullski here, cook this up just to aggravate the rest of us. So I'll let him explain what the topic of tonight is. Take it away.
Hello, I'm Comrade Bullski. You may know me from social media. I'm a guy who writes about comics. I've been doing this with Elvis and Judge a couple of times before. But I think, Judge, do you want to introduce yourself to the listeners first?
Sure, absolutely. For anyone who hasn't heard any of our previous guest episodes, my name is Judge Anon, not actually, but I also write about comics and I also write comics sometimes, and I would like to continue doing both for the foreseeable future. Thank you very much for having me, guys.
Exactly. Thank you very much for hosting this, Elvis. Okay, so tonight we're going to talk about one of the, I should say, iconic concepts from comic books. Something that everybody's heard about, everybody loves it. We're going to talk about retcons tonight. Now, the idea of retcon, before we went on air here, Judge went on like a really long explanation of what a retcon is by the definition of it. But in a sense, it's a retroactive continuity. Oh, I can hear myself constantly. It's sort of echoing in my headset.
It's fine on my end. I think it's just for you.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So a retcon, it's a retroactive continuity. It means that you change something, you insert a new story, or you update something. It can have a few different applications, like you can either change something entirely, and then you often call it like a reboot or something like that. Or you can just change tiny details, which is very, very common. It happens a lot in long-running comic book series. And this hasn't really been around forever, well, sort of, but it sort of became formalized in like the 70s and 80s when comic book fandom sort of took off. It's a very much a fandom concept in essence. Roy Thomas was very big on this. He wrote a lot of retcon stories in his time. But today, I would say that the word retcon has gained something of like a negative connotation for many people. Like people are like, "Oh, another retcon!" Like, "Oh my god, they changed somebody's origin for like the 50th time." So, sort of what we're going to do tonight is that we're gonna just freewheel a little bit and talk about retcons in comic books, what we think about them, like specific examples and stuff like that, how we feel that they can be used for good or bad, or neutral, perhaps. So we're just gonna roundtable this essentially. Are you guys ready to talk about retcons?
Yeah,
I wasn't actually ready, but they didn't retcon me into being ready for this, so now I'm ready.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, Superboy Prime has punched reality and made us prepared for this horrible, horrible thing. So I'm gonna start by asking you two. Let's start with Elvis. If I say retcon, what's the first story that pops into your head? Like the first thing you think of when I say retcon?
it's hard because when you say retcon, it's like, well, there's different levels, right? It's like, oh, this person was born in the '60s, but I'm born in the '80s, so that'll pop up. Or like, oh, this person didn't used to have this port in their origin, but now they do, or this minor difference, or this costume design, or some such. It's like, so when you say retcon, I think the first thing that comes to mind is one that I always think about. Um, Retconning that Omak is Commandy's grandfather.
Oh
Which I like.
yeah,
Which I like. I think that's pretty neat. I think that creates a nice little set for that story. And I think it's neat. I like it. I like that.
that's an interesting one because they are obviously both Jack Kirby characters.
Mhm.
They were not connected by Kirby. He did not do this himself. It was, I think, it happened after Crisis. I want to
Yeah,
say.
I think there was like a backup story. And I think might sometimes think it's like something burned it or or something like that, but it's not. I think it was like a backup serial um back up on some other thing where it's like the New Adventures of Omak, and then it just kind of made that leap.
Yeah.
Other than that, I'm
Yeah,
not quite sure.
wasn't that in John Burns' Somac?
No, John Bird's Omak was entirely just a totally different thing.
Yeah, that was like an
And
Elseworlds kind
yeah,
of thing. It was a very different take on OMAC as well.
pretty good though. Pretty good.
Yeah, I think because I don't think in the original Kirby story you don't really see Commander's grandfather that much. Like you don't really see who he is or
Yeah,
anything like that. So
he appears like in one panel on the first
yeah,
page. Man, he's off.
exactly. So he could be OMAC or like Buddy Blank, more Buddy Blank than OMAC. But yeah,
And,
that's. I
and,
mean,
and, and it's a good kind of lift from that story because Omak's whole deal is that he's meant to be like, protecting the world from all the stuff that would like, you know, encroach on it, corporations, nations, war, greed,
yeah.
that kind of stuff. And then at the end of the Kirby serial, like that's over. Like Omak is like finito, and it's like ends on a really big downer. Um, but then like yeah, Kamani is like and like you have like climate change and destruction, post-apocalyptic, that kind of stuff. Like you can see like he Mac failed, and now Commandy is like the consequence of that, and like that's I think that works. It's a natural link. It's a natural link.
Hmm. Yeah, I don't think it's. I don't think it's very invasive either. It doesn't really change either story that much, so it just kind of works in my head. All right. So, Judge, if I say retcon, what's the first story that pops into your head?
Well, I usually think of like the big ones, but the thing is that I think this is where we need to like get into the weeds of what a retcon is.
Yeah.
Because, for example, if I told you, okay, what is the biggest retcon ever, and we could go, well, Crisis on Infinite Earths is like the biggest retcon ever, and it's like, well, no, because the idea of a retcon, of a retroactive continuity, is going back to something and changing it. And Crisis on Infinite Earths actually starts from scratch. It's a whole reboot. So while it reorganizes continuity and it reorders a lot of events, I would say that if we got like super specific, it's not technically a retcon because it's starting a whole new story while using all those things. So I think that like a better example of a retcon would be something like Superboy. It would be something like, well, was Clark Kent ever a did he put in his costume while he was in Smallville? Yes or no?
Yeah.
Like that to me is a bit more interesting. Everything that has to do with the Legion, for example, is
Oh,
also
goodness.
yeah.
Yeah.
Let's just jump right into the bear trap.
Oh, yeah, it's like stepping into the bear trap immediately. Like, yeah, you just feel it closing in, and John Byrne is like grinning at you from behind a tree.
Yeah,
No, but
because
yeah, yeah. Please go on.
I think like a lot of that happens when you go from people writing comics as a job to people writing comics as a passion. Like the moment someone like Roy Thomas gets to work in comics, things start to shift, and suddenly things that nobody writing them really cared about start getting a lot more thought, and then it becomes, well, what can we do to amend all this? So like one of my favorite, my funniest one, for example, is everything that Bob Haney ever wrote
Yeah.
happened in its own alternate Earth.
Yes.
That is
Which
hilarious.
is amazingly specific, but specifically Bob Kanigher, he really, really hated those Brave and the Bold stories where Batman teamed up with Sergeant Rock. Because in Kanigher's mind, Sergeant Rock died at the end of World War II. That was like his arc, that he died from, like, I think he says like the final bullet fired in World War II
Yep.
was the one that killed Sergeant Rock.
Yeah.
And he was like, he can't like be an old man and team up with Batman. Like that doesn't work. He dies. And Bob Haney was like, I don't care. Like, and then Denny O'Neil took the Kanigher side of it, and he was like, this probably is not gonna be canon from now on.
Yeah, it's so funny that nowadays you think of like creator specific universes as a gift. Like if you're a huge creator and you have a lot of clout, you get
Yep.
your own universe to play in. But like you go back 40, 50 years and it's like, oh my god, I don't want to deal with the continuity messes that this guy is making. Let's just give him his own earth.
Yeah, and they called it Earth 1B or something ridiculous like that. It was never an official designation. Like DC never used it themselves. It was very much informal.
Yeah.
But yeah, they definitely went out and said, yeah, this stuff is not really canon like a lot of this Brave and the Bold stuff. That didn't really happen with Batman,
So yeah,
which is
that's like the maybe like the most one of the really hard versions of retcon, which is just cutting something off entirely,
yeah.
like not even bothering to try to balance it or change it. It's no, this just has to go.
Which is again funny because those Bob Haney Brave and the Bold comics, they're very cheesy and they're very unique. Like Bob Haney is a very unique writer. If you've ever like listeners, if you've never read a Bob Haney comic, please do. Especially his Batman comics, because his Batman is fucking hilarious. Like he is not buying the entire like grim detective thing. Like Batman is so goofy in his comics, but those are very fun comics to read. They're very entertaining. Most of them, they're bug nuts crazy, but they're not like bad comics. So it's funny that they made people so annoyed just because they didn't fit into continuity. That's like a very fanboyish kind of thought process in my mind. But yeah, so you mentioned the John Byrne Superman thing after Crisis. A lot of people think that Superman was rebooted in Crisis, which is not true. That entire deal wasn't even finished when Crisis was, like, the final issue was completed. The John Byrne thing was still in the works, so to speak. So there was like an interim period in 1986 when they were still putting out like Bronze Age Superman comics after Crisis. Which is one of those things that really makes these DC reboots so confusing, is that they don't really retcon things with the big event. They do it like afterwards, like a couple years afterwards. Like fucking Hawkworld happened in 1989. That's almost 5 years after Crisis. So it just happens like in the middle of nothing. It's very, very confusing.
Oh, we will be talking about Hawkman later.
Yeah, that's part of how our online discussion started back in the day, Judge, when we did that Hawkman origin thing. Okay, so I'm going to bring up a big retcon thing that actually isn't related to superheroes as well, but I think we should mention something that it also happens in other media. Because when Disney purchased Star Wars, they retconned pretty much every existing expanded universe story out of existence and turned it into Legends. And then they restarted that entire shebang with their so-called Star Wars canon. They just call it canon now. Which was a big thing, and is still a big thing today, I would say. How do you guys feel about that entire thing, Elvis?
Well, it's not like George ever cared about that stuff to begin with. Anyway, his stuff was like, if it's not in the movie, it doesn't count. So, I mean, only kind of nerds care about it. The
Yep.
worst kind of nerds.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you had, when Lucasfilm were in charge of it, you had this weird continuity tier system for Star Wars, where it's like, oh, what is it? Is it S tier? Is it L tier? Is it D tier? Is it whatever? What do you think about that thing, Judge?
I'm going to go on something that Elvis mentioned, which is the idea that only nerds cared about that stuff, because he's absolutely correct. But the thing that I think is interesting is when you get to moments where the companies themselves try to go to the nerds and say, no, you're right, this is super important and this is super something that's really important. So we're going to do our best to get everything sorted out. And that's like the main difference to me between how LucasArts and Lucas saw the extended universe, the EU, and how Disney sees it. Like LucasArts saw the EU as something that would keep Star Wars in people's minds in between movies and would keep
Mm.
like the money coming, but not something that was really important. It was just like, well, here's some comics, here's some games. How does it all fit together? Who cares? Just
Yep.
wait until the next movie. Meanwhile, Disney says, no, 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 actually, we need to get everything sorted out because we're going to make comics, I'm going to make shows, I'm going to make movies, I'm going to make games, and everything is going to connect together. So you will have to buy all of it.
Yeah.
And that's like the main difference. It's one thing to say, I want a huge cohesive universe because I, as a writer, as a creator, want it. And it's another to say, I want a huge cohesive universe because I want people to buy as much of it as possible.
Mm.
And that's not to say that Lucas cared about any of that thing, because clearly he didn't. But some of the people who do get into retcons, who do try that, do come into it because they feel personally that the story doesn't make sense otherwise, that they
Mm.
need to do these things because otherwise they just can't get into the story. And I think that's like the three main categories I go of why people retcon stuff. It's one, just because, or why people make extended universes, because either you want to keep things going and keep people interested in something, or because you want the most people possible to buy all the things possible, or because you personally, as a creator, want it.
Yeah.
That was a big day. I kind of mixed two completely different things, but yeah, that's my opinion on how this whole EU stuff goes.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting as well that back when the EU was still like the current thing, there was a there were a lot of Star Wars fans who were like super dismissive of it and were like, oh god, like all of those comics and novels and stuff, that's so bad. Like, and then suddenly when Disney says like, oh, this isn't canon, then all of these people just crawl out of the woodwork who are like, how dare you retcon this story? Like, it's this entire contrarianism is so fascinating with retcons. Like, whenever something gets retconned, the people are just some people are just always going to side with the thing that was removed, even if it's terrible.
I'm going to get on one of my favorite soapboxes about this, and I think it's because a lot of people, let's say, of the nerdy persuasion, they like stories that have the kind of logic and the kind of rationality and the kind of order that reality doesn't have. They search entertainment that gives them that feeling of orderly, of like an ordered bookshelf. This thing happened, and it happened because of this, and I was able to see the thing happen, and that's it. It's not like real world history where you can go, well, actually this thing happened, but it was really complicated, and there's a
Yeah,
lot.
yeah, yeah.
No, a comic, a movie will tell you this is the thing that happened. And so when people who get really into it are suddenly confronted with someone coming in and say, no, actually that didn't happen, or actually we're going to change how that happened, it upsets them the way someone who got the way someone who learned something in high school and then never thought about it again, just took it as a given thing, and
Mm.
then 10 years later learned that that thing was fake, and suddenly go, well, that can't be right. They taught me that in high school. My entire reality is getting completely changed. And if you add that to fiction, you get people who say, no, that you're trying to change my reality, you're trying to change the reality that I find comforting and that I have, what's the word, fucking, that I connect with, that I have put all of my thought into. You're trying to change it. And because fiction can be changed and fiction can be molded like that, it becomes an attack. It becomes, you are changing this to piss me off.
Yeah.
And then it just gets ridiculous. It just gets stupid. But yeah, it all comes from people who like the idea of an orderly universe suddenly getting that order completely shaken.
Yeah, and I think you're right because, like, as far as we know, retcons don't happen in reality. If they did, we wouldn't know about it, which is pretty terrifying. But like, it's not something that you experience in real life. So like, it's sort of unnatural, like in terms of storytelling. It sort of goes against your instincts. Like, oh, story has a start and a beginning and an end, and then it maybe leads into something else and so on. And then somebody goes like, as you said, somebody goes like, oh, but that didn't happen, but this happened instead. And it can get confusing. But it's also, you notice this changed approach with Star Wars was pretty fascinating when it was still a little bit more fresh. When the Solo movie came out, that I mean, you know about there's a post-credit scene in that with Darth Maul. You know that, right?
Yep, I absolutely know that, and I also know that that movie recanonized one of my favorite dumb little things in Star Wars.
Oh, Teres Cassie.
Yeah, baby, exactly, baby. They brought that back. They brought it back. Arden Lynn is running around that universe somewhere with her dumb metal arm.
It's the most 90s Star Wars fighting game ever, where you just, yeah. But yeah, so okay, so when that post-credit scene came out, a lot of people were like, when I like in spaces where I was, they were like, oh, like Darth Maul is alive again, like, oh, that means that he's gonna be in a future movie, and then people had to come in and explain to them, no, he's actually dead because he had his final confrontation with Obi-Wan in the Rebels cartoon, which had run just a little bit like a year before I think that episode ran. And then people were like, but that's a cartoon, like that's not like canon, is it? And people were like, yeah, it is canon now. Like that's how Disney is playing it. And then people were like, but why is he in the movie then if he's already dead? Like this isn't going to lead to anything. And like, yep, that's how Disney's doing this. I still don't know why he's in that scene at the end of that movie, because it really doesn't lead to anything. Like they haven't followed up on that except in the comics a little bit, which is like, yeah, okay, sure.
Look, man, not every seed you plant will bear fruit.
Yeah, especially not when you stop doing spin-off movies for Star Wars entirely, because Solo didn't do that well.
Rip.
Yeah, rip. That movie isn't great though. Like it's, I don't hate it because it's Disney, but I still think it's pretty boring. Like,
Yep.
honestly, it's just very, oh yeah, like the origin of Han Solo's blaster, and like, yeah, fascinating stuff, guys. Okay, so we're gonna zoom back now to comic books, a little bit more centralized on comic books from now on. I'm going to start with a retcon which actually got mentioned by one of our people who commented here on my little thread, and he said that Captain America being in the ice is one of the best retcons. And this is the point where you start to think about retcons that happened 60 years ago now. So obviously none of us were born back then. Some of our parents may not have been born back then. I don't know. It's a long time ago. But 1963, we're back in 1963. Marvel is kicking off again. They are hitting their stride in 1963. It's the year of the X-Men, the year of the Avengers, the year when the Thor comic finally becomes good. And in the pages of the Avengers find a mysterious figure encased in ice. Who could it be? Could it be the Human Torch? Could it be the Golden Age Vision? Or maybe like the Silver Skull? No, it's Captain America. And Captain America, it turns out he's been frozen in ice since 1945. And we get a little bit of a flashback where he and Bucky, his wartime partner, try to stop the mysterious Dr. Zemo from launching like a drone attack on the United States. And Bucky dies, and he's dead forever. And Captain America falls into the Arctic waters and gets frozen, where he lies for, at the time it would have been like less than 20 years, something like 18 years or something like that at the time. Today it's much, much longer. But the thing is, in the original version, in the Golden Age, Marvel kept publishing Captain America comics all the way from all the way into 1949, I think was the final issue. So there were like 5 years almost of comics that they just decided, nope, this didn't happen. And then there was also a revival of Captain America in 1953, where he fought communists. Also didn't happen. And essentially, I think here we touch on something that Judge mentioned before, is that people didn't care that much about this kind of stuff back then. I think when Jack Kirby came up with this, with possible Stan Lee involvement, I think he just didn't care. Like, I think he just went, yeah, sure, it's cooler if Captain America was frozen. I don't care about all of these other comics that also existed. So I don't think there was any deeper thought into it, but obviously it changed the Marvel Universe quite a bit, and it turned into kind of one of Captain America's iconic character beats, is that he's the man out of time, right? Like, I mean, that was in the movies as well. So how do you guys feel about this entire shebang, Elvis?
I mean, it's like that Sergeant Rock thing, you know, it's something about that kind of character archetype that feels so of a place that it feels weird to have it outside of that place. Now, with Sergeant Rock, there's nothing really you can do about that. With Captain America, I feel like that's a pretty fun solution. It's pulpy in that kind of way. Like, oh, he was frozen in suspended animation. It's like that kind of, you know, that kind of old school pulpiness that you kind of expect. So I think it works pretty seamlessly. I like it a lot.
Yeah. Judge?
I think it also, the other thing that's interesting is like it gives an extra bit of drama to it. It adds the extra whole man out of time thing. And I think that also, you know, in 63, it still wasn't like the peak, but it was getting into that peak of counterculture movement. So you have this character that even at the time would have seemed a little hokey, like this flag guy, even at the time would have been, he would have already, even if he'd never been frozen in ice, even if they had just gone, no, yeah, this is the same Captain America, and now he's joining all these heroes, he would have still felt out of place. He would have still felt out of time purely by the way he was. So taking that sort of external theme and make it into an integral part of his character, absolutely genius move. Not sure how much of that was intentional or not, but really genius, absolute move from either Lee or Kirby or both, probably. So yeah, that's one of the cases where it works because it works thematically. It adds a thematic extra to the character and to his situation.
Yeah, I totally agree. Obviously, I can't be objective about this because this happened like many decades before I was born, and like every version of Captain America I've ever read has had this as canon. So I didn't even know about this until like I was an adult. And I think it's great. Like it's wonderful. It making him a man out of time is just such a good character beat for him. Like even back in the 60s, then he was wandering around and just being like, oh, I feel like the entire world has passed me by. It's also funny because at the time, obviously, the time difference wasn't that big. So in the first Avengers issue, where he's de-thawed, he meets like people in the street, and they were like, "Oh yeah, I met you when I was in the army, and now I'm like a middle-aged man." And like obviously, that gap has increased much more now, and he's like even more alienated than he used to be. But I think it really works. Also, they milked the death of Bucky so fucking hard. Like, I don't know how much you've read like 60s and 70s Captain America, but like shit, he has angst over Bucky like every 3 or 4 issues at least.
That one Steranko page that is like 20 Bucky faces staring at him.
Yeah. It also gives him kind of like, there's also like a cool character arc with that, which is the first time they do that in Avengers, because like he's fucking out for blood against Zemo in that original Masters of Evil arc that they sort of pick up on like in the first year or so of Avengers stories. Like Cap is like, I'm gonna get this fucking guy, and he does get him in the end. Like he kills him in South America, like accidentally, but still, like he is not terribly broken up about Zemo dying. I mean, he's a Nazi, so whatever. Like, But yeah, so I think this is one that we can say works at least. Obviously, Steve Englehart and Roy Thomas would later sort of recanonize all of these lost Captain America stories as being like replacement Captain Americas. Like Steve Englehart did that story where that guy gets de-thawed, the communist basher Captain America. I don't know if you read that one. He turns up later. I think he turns up in the Brubaker run as well. That guy, the commie guy. But yeah, so that's obviously one of the very early retcons. Like that's an explicit retcon. So let's see. I'm looking at my little list here. I'm gonna do one more, and then I'm gonna turn over to you guys again. But I think we should talk about another one that I think works first from my table, and it's Batman Year One. Which is a story that you don't immediately think of like, oh, this is a retcon, but I mean, it's very much a retcon because in that story, Frank Miller was given completely free hands to reinvent Batman's origin, and there are a lot of things from his like Silver Age stuff that they totally dropped from his origin with that story, and that hasn't come back since. Outside of some cheeky references and stuff like that. They streamlined down Batman's origin a lot. They made Alfred was there from the start. He wasn't somebody who joined Batman later, which I think is one of the more important changes. How do you guys feel about Batman Year One as a retcon? Not as, you don't need to tell me that it's a good story. I know it's a good comic, but like, how do you feel about it as an updated Batman origin? Judge, let's go with you first this time.
I think like the most important part was the streamlining part of it, because by then Batman had a ton of stuff going on, and like his origin, it's funny because nowadays you can't go two steps without someone reminding you about Batman's origin. But back then it was like this was something that happened and that was it. And maybe we'll mention it a couple of times, but everyone was worried into like the here and the now. So Year One being like, no, let's actually go back. Let's turn that like one page of Batman of Bruce lifting a dumbbell and make a story out of it. It's like on one hand it was necessary at the time, first to sort of remind people of the origin, to streamline it post crisis, and also I think like the most important part about Year One is that it's a tone setter. It's a story that you can give to someone and say, these 4 issues is what the tone of Batman is gonna be from now on. Not just what the origin is going to be, not just what the origins of all these other supporting cast members are going to be. This is what the stories themselves are going to sound like, what they're going to look like, what kind of logic they're going to have and follow. So it's a great story, and it's worth it in those terms, in terms of necessity of creating a tone for Batman.
Very much in the tone of, for example, Dennis O'Neil and Neil Adams's Batman comics. Like you can read Year One and it's sort of the same take on Batman as that. So I think it fits in very well with like reestablishing this is what we're going with like in the future as well. Like, and I think that's why Denny liked it as well and liked to go with it. What do you think, Elvis?
Well, for me, when you mention Year One and you mention Retcon, my mind immediately goes to Kevin Smith's story. That's like, oh, remember that part in Batman Year One?
Oh, the fucking widening gyre or whatever the fuck.
When it's like, that cool scene when he opens, when he blows up the meeting of all the crime bosses.
Yeah.
And it's like, none of you are safe from now on. And then Kevin's just like, you know what? Let's have this part of the book where I'm like, he's actually pissing his pants out of fear the entire time.
Yep.
Genius.
The great Kevin Smith contributing his brilliant addition to the Batman mythos.
Holy water sports, Batman.
Oh, God.
Jesus Christ. But yeah, no. Other than that, year one. I mean, it exists. It is what it is. I think Judge said pretty much everything that needs to be said about it. Because like it's, I mean, it's so of its place. The thing about year one is, just like as I mentioned, like more ironically, how other things, then developed upon it. Because
Yeah.
even Frank Miller himself, when he did like his own sequel to Year One, also controversial, the All Star Batman and Robin, and he's like, actually, Batman was like this crazy, immature freak immediately after that happened. So, it comes and goes. I think that it's it understood what it wanted to be, and it turns out that that's what people wanted it after all. So what else can you
I
do?
I think All Star Batman and Robin is one of the funniest comics I've ever read, but I don't
It's
think
so
it was.
intense. I think it's intentional. I mean,
It might be intentional, but I think some things I think Frank Miller actually thinks are cool, but
yeah, but
they're just
I think
so Frank Millery.
I think he thinks they're cool in a big way. That's the
Yeah.
thing. I think he knows he's being silly, but he thinks he's cool in a silly way. I get the same like tone from like his Spirit movie. Like these are silly and ridiculous, but that's what he likes. He likes being silly and ridiculous. So I don't know. Yeah, it's
Oh,
like
that script page from All Star Batman and Robin where Frank Miller is talking about Vicky Vale's ass like
yeah,
constantly.
yeah.
Like
He knows he's being
that
over the top
man
of
is
it.
very, very horny. He's so horny. Like stop
Yeah,
being so horny, Frank
yeah,
Miller.
but he knows it. He's being over the top of it. I don't know.
Yeah.
Fuck
Uh,
the car, man.
And I mean,
Sorry.
obviously, probably the most controversial aspect of year one is prostitute Catwoman, which is something that DC has. Actually, one of the few things on year one that they've actually backtracked on a couple of times. Like they went, oh no, Catwoman wasn't actually a prostitute. Like she was working there to help the prostitutes. I think was the most common version that they used. Uh, that's also that was kind of a controversial aspect of it. I think. Pretty much, but yeah, Frank Miller, man, what a guy. So I'm gonna hand over the mic to you, Judge. You said you had prepared some retcons you wanted to talk about, so let's hear what you got. What do you got cooking?
I have two. I have a retcon that I really like, that I think is like my platonic
Ooh.
ideal of a retcon, and a
Ooh.
retcon that I absolutely detest in every single possible aspect. And I'm gonna let you two decide which one goes first.
Oh. What do you think, Elvis? Do we want to be happy or angry?
Whichever, I mean, we're gonna get to it anyway.
Let's do the good one first, just to start with that.
So I told you it was gonna happen, and it's going to happen. We are gonna talk about Hawkman,
Oh yeah.
but we're not gonna talk about the Hawksnar.
No.
We are going to talk about my favorite Hawkman retcon, which is the one from Hawkworld Annual 1980. Which one it is?
I think
1990, the
1990.
first one.
Yes.
Yeah. So that one is a John Ostrander joint from when this was after Hawkworld Volume 1, the Tim Truman one, and Ostrander got to write Hawkworld Volume 2 and 3. And the annual is the first time of Volume 2. So let's set the stage a little bit. We talked about this with Bullski a couple of times, but Hawkman is a really great example of one of the main problems with huge continuity reboots, which is okay. We want to start from scratch. We want to start from zero. We want to start from square one, but we also want to keep all the old stuff because
Mhm.
Hawkworld, the original Hawkworld, my understanding is that when it was first created, when it was first pitched, it was going to be this is going to be Hawkman. There is no Carter Hall, there is no Silver Age. This is Hawkman from scratch. And then at like the last second, I think like the first two issues of the mini were already written, and they said, well, no, actually, we would very much like to keep Carter Hall and the Justice Society version of the Hawks. We would very much like to keep those. And the annual was Ostrander's way of trying to tie it all together. And the solution that he found was that The Hogwarts Hawks are a Qatar Hall and Sharia Thol who come from Thanagar, who are the modern greedy versions of the Silver Age Hawks, the Space Cop Hawks. And their whole deal was that they came from a super fascist society that took a lot of pride in their planetary conquests and their achievements, and specifically the achievements of Qatar's father, Paran Qatar, who had been the one who had discovered Nth Metal and who had created the wings that created the wingmen, the flying corpse of super fasci space cops from Thanagar. And it was like a whole huge point of pride, not just for Thanagar, but for Qatar himself. So in the annual, what they the there's violin infused time travel because this is still fucking comics, and Qatar and Shaira managed to go back to the Golden Age, and they meet Qatar's father, who was a Thanagarian scout who had come to Earth and who had befriended Carter Hall, Golden Age Hawkman, and who had found that Carter had also been studying anti gravity technology, and that he was getting really far ahead with them. And then I think he had discovered Carter had discovered Nth Metal, and Paran is like, well, I knew that he had discovered it, but I also knew that the technology of Earth isn't advanced enough right now for this to be anything. So without him finding out, I substituted a couple of metal pieces, and that allowed the Nth Metal to work. And that is when Carter gets his wings and becomes Hawkman. And so, what I like about that retcon, and it goes back to something that we were talking about earlier, is putting aside the weirdo contrivances and the just weird convoluted stuff going on, putting aside the reason that the reason why this needed to be done is dumb and shouldn't have happened, I am absolutely in love with the thematic resonance of that retcon, with the idea that this huge symbol of pride for the Thanagarian fascists was not created entirely by a Thanagarian. That Qatar's father, the great Paran Qatar, the great scientist, the great man who gave Thanagar its wings and allowed its conquest of the universe, was a fucking liar who
Mm.
more or less stole a discovery from a world that they considered a backwater, that they considered just like not worthy of looking into. The story itself also paints Para and Qatar's dad as being like, well, actually, that was by design. I told Thanagar that Earth was a backwater, so they wouldn't invade it because I have fallen in love with this world and its people, and they're really good. But the thing that I love about it is that Hawk World Volume 1 and a lot of Volume 2 is a lot about Qatar and Shaira breaking out of these fascist preconceptions, of this ideal of their world as the beacon of civilization and the beacon of science and heroism. And this discovery that no, actually, the entire symbol of your warrior culture is more or less stolen. Yeah, that is worth all the time traveling violent shit you want, man. Like that's the kind of thematic depth that only that a guy like Ostrander can bring to the table. It's like, yeah, we're gonna do something goofy and silly, and we're going to do this patchwork thing to marry two things that really we shouldn't even be bothering about this, but we're going to tell you something with it. We're going to make a fucking story out of it, and I love it. And I also love that annual actually has at the end 2 pages written by Mike Gold, the editor at the time, explaining what a retcon is
Yes.
and explaining like all the different kinds of how they all the different resources that they use to manage continuity. And that
Yep.
was like
The
in
why he goes
1990.
read those 2 pages are part of why I started thinking about this originally. I love everything that Mike Gold writes. He's such a fucking good he's such a good editor as well. Brought all this talent over to DC. But yeah, I really love that one. I think that's the one where he says Like there there are some characters and like situations that are just like hopelessly like snarled and confusing, and like there is a special level in hell reserved for writers who bring these back. I think he says something like that, and that's fucking stuck with me all of these years, like from when I first read that. And man, do some writers love bringing back stuff that should never have been brought back? You know,
Yep.
you know what I mean?
Yep. Absolutely. I've sent you a link to the two pages. So when we upload this, I would recommend adding it because they're interesting because not only are they a definition of how continuity works, but they're an inside baseball way of seeing it. Like this is how the chief editor at the time described continuity, and that is like super interesting to me.
And there are also a matching set of pages in Black Hawk Annual One, which also came out in 1990 by Mike Gold, where he also talks about continuity and like how they manage it and stuff. And I do not have scans of those pages, which sucks ass, but it's very interesting. But yeah, so I love this story. This is a great. I think this is a rare case of Ostrander doing damage control. Because a lot of the time in, for example, Suicide Squad, Ostrander was very happy to just ignore previous continuity. Like he wasn't really diving into the weeds of like, oh, this character who's in here, I'm gonna explain like how their new canon works in the new DC. He was just like, let's just go with it. They're gonna die anyway. So having him actually sit down and do damage control on something is fascinating to me. And yeah, it's a little bit contrived, but I think it works out. I think it works for the best. So yeah, a really good example. Have you read this story, Elvis? Do you have any Hawkman? Do you have any hot Hawkman takes, Elvis?
No, you can move on. Sorry, it's a little bit busy over here right now.
Oh, no worries. Okay, so which one was the one that you really hated, Judge?
The one that I really hate, and this is like the one I picked is because I dislike every aspect of it.
Oh
There is
goodness!
there is
It's not just like, oh, I think this was a good idea, but it was sort of handled badly. This is just, I fucking wish this. I want this to die.
yeah, it's a bunch of things that have a lot of different details, and I don't like each and every single one of them in varying degrees. But it's one of those where I'm like, I really wish this wouldn't have happened, and that is the completely reworked origin of Lady Shiva from Batgirl, from the last arc of Anderson
Ah,
Gavrich's Batgirl run.
here we go. There it is.
So there's, for those who haven't, the original origin, the back in like 1975, which by the way, hey guys, I want everyone to know that Lady Shiva will be turning 50 years old this year in September. So if you want to send gifts and birthday cards and appreciation presents, now's the time. DC, if you want to make a mini series of an ongoing, now's the year to do it. Please go ahead and do it. Ed Boon, if you're listening to this, I know you're listening. You're a big fan. If you want to put Lady Shiva in Injustice 3, now's the year. Now's the time. Let's go. Let's do this. That aside, back in 1975, her origin was the most hilariously simple shit ever. It was just, hey, this completely normal person, this completely normal woman had a sister. That sister fell in love with one Richard Dragon. That sister got damsel in distress and then fridged like a motherfucker. Like that was just obscenely obvious. And then a guy called, and you guys know this, but I want to mention this for the people who are listening to this and who may not have read that. A guy called, I shit you not, Guano Cravat convinced this completely normal woman that, hey, your sister was actually killed by Richard Dragon and you should go kill him. And this completely normal woman, instead of buying like a gun or hiring a dude to go kill him, just says, I am going to turn myself into the greatest martial artist in the world in like 6 months. I'm going to beat his ass into the ground. And he beats his ass like pretty hard. And then while they're fighting, Wano Cravat just goes like, haha, you guys are dumb. You're fighting because I'm actually the guy who killed your sister. And Richard is like, you see? You see? And they beat him up together. And that is her entire origin. It's just, I wanted to get revenge. And so I turned myself into the world's greatest fighter in the world. And I got my revenge. And that is issue one of her appearances, and then there's like 14 more issues of her showing up saying shit like, "Oh yeah, I'm gonna hang out with Richard Dragon because danger follows him anywhere, and without danger, my life is empty." And
And
that's
accumulating a wall of swords as well.
yeah, absolutely. Like she goes from completely normal person to this is my assassin lair with my wall of swords in just like the span of a year. It is incredible, and it's very simple and it's very basic and it's very obvious, but I always like the idea of this woman who was completely normal turning herself into like an invincible kung fu fighter, getting her revenge, and then having to decide, well, I can't go back to just being a normal person. That's fucking lame. Just go dive right into danger and peril and fighting guys in the Himalayas. So that was 1975. It took them until 2006, I think, for them to get around to retconning that. This was at the tail end of Cassandra Cain's Batgirl run, which to this day is still like the longest unbroken Batgirl title ever. And by the end of it, it had been taken over by Anderson Gavrich. And the very last arc of that run is Cassandra figuring, well, I want to know who my mom is. I know who my dad is. I fucking hate the guy. I would like very much to know who my mother is. And it all comes from talking to Onyx, a member of the League of Assassins, who sort of lets it slip that actually Lady Shiva was a woman from Detroit called Sandra, who may have been normal or not. And that just kind of starts spinning wheels in Cassandra's head and says, okay, I'm going to find out. And eventually she does find out. And it all culminates in issue 73, which has like 6 pages dedicated to a whole new backstory for Shiva. And I absolutely hate every single part of it. Everything about it. I just despise it. Basically, the new origin is that, okay, the girl who would become Lady Shiva, Sandra, and her sister Carolyn, the girl who had been fridged like but at that point like 30 plus years ago, they were kung fu prodigies living in Detroit, apparently as orphans because their father, the parents are never mentioned in this new version of the story, and they were really good at doing punchy kiki stuff, and they did demonstrations and they participated in some fights, and they caught the eye of David Kane, Cassandra's father, who was looking for like the perfect mom to breed the perfect child. Yes, boy, here we go again. It's eugenics all over. And she notices this too and says, well, they're both pretty good, but I'm noticing that the little one, Sandra, is a little bit better. But she keeps letting the older one win because she loves her so much. Clearly, there must be a way to bridge this problem. And the way is with like a bullet. And so David goes and kills Carolyn, and Sandra goes nuts and goes up to beat him up. He sets up an ambush with a bunch of other members of the League of Assassins, and eventually he, puts a gun to Sandra's head and says, "Hey, you can have my son, or you can have this bullet." And Sandra says, "I would very much prefer the son. Thank you very much." And that is already pretty nasty and pretty disgusting. And it gets even worse when during the flashback there's a part where while Sandra is living with David, she says that she came to thank him for having killed Carolyn, for having released her from Carolyn's influence and allowing her to become Lady Shiva. So she eventually has Cass and abandons her immediately to David. And the kicker, like the final capstone to all of this, are there are two things that are the final capstones to this retcon. One is Shiva saying that one of the reasons why she had Cass was so that someone would be able to kill her if she ever became like too much of a monster. And the other is that she actually misses Carolyn every single day of her life. Like every single day she thinks about her. I don't like any part of that at all. Like there is everything about that. I go from I would I could live with this, but I would prefer they didn't do it, to this is an affront against humanity and it never should have happened. So going in order, it's like the most obvious one is Cassandra being Shiva's daughter. It's something I've made my peace with, and it's something that I think you can still get a lot of good storytelling out of it. You can get some good stories from it. But the greatest story with Shiva and Cassandra together was the first 25 issues of that run, and they were complete strangers. And in a way, I think that them being complete strangers is part of what makes that story good. So that's something like I don't mind it, but I maybe would have preferred it didn't happen, and also because it ties Shiva too much to Cassandra. And so we get to points where Cassandra gets to have stories, Shiva gets to have stories with Cassandra in them. But that's a whole nother thing. The other part that this one I dislike a little bit more. I don't like Shiva being from Detroit. I get why it's made. It's made because they want to show you that this almost superhuman person can come from the humble beginnings of the township of Detroit. But you could have done that with any city, man. You could have done that with Hong Kong. You could have done that with Beijing. You could have done that with Singapore. Doing it with Detroit sounds like, well, this is a comic for Americans, so we need to find an American city. It feels like if you want to take some of the mysticism away from Shiva, that's fine. But taking away that mysticism and putting it in America feels very, very American, pejorative.
So they do not actually. Danny O'Neill does not actually mention where Shiva and Carolyn are from in Richard Dragon Kung Fu Fighter, right?
Nope.
Like
At
they
no
just
point.
appear out of thin air in that.
Yeah.
But maybe we can infer that they were supposed to be like from actually Asia, like that they weren't Americans or
Oh yeah,
Asian
absolutely.
Americans. I don't know.
Yeah.
But later you got the. Do you like the assassin village better, Judge?
Oh, we'll get to that. We'll get to that. But first, let me. I still
Yes,
got a
please,
couple
Pun.
of points to hit, but I'm going to tell about the village. I will tell you at the end of this, and it involves me. It involves a really fun little encounter. So, the thing that I dislike a bit more, I don't like any origin where Sandra and Carolyn were already good at kung fu from the start, because I think that puts an element of fate to it. Like Sandra was always going to end up being Lady Shiva. And I think that steals the strength of the original origin of Sandra being just a completely normal person who decided, I am going to become this. Because that has a lot more agency, even if she's getting tricked, even if she's being lied to. The decision to, I am going to abandon everything I am and everything I was and everything I will be to become this thing that can beat the shit out of the guy who killed my sister is a lot stronger than, well, she was always good. She was always going to be that. Like there's an element of ego death that's not present in any origin where Shiva and Carolyn were already prodigies. And then we get to like the big one. Then we get to the one that I'm like, this is abjectly terrible, which is the whole "have my son or I will kill you."
Hmm.
Because I've heard a couple of discussions about this from a couple of people, and I would like to make my stance clear. That is sexual assault. I don't give a fuck if, because I've seen some people saying, "Well, she took the offer, right?" And I'm going like, "Yeah, at gunpoint." Like,
Yeah,
it,
that's not going to fly in a court of law, you know. Like it's so fucked up.
like
Like
if I put a gun to your face and say, "Hey, give me your wallet," and you give me your wallet, did you consent to be taking your wallet?
yeah.
So that's fucked up. And it's extra fucked up that they straight up have her saying, but after a while, I was like, yeah, that was actually really cool. It was actually really nice that he killed my sister. And there's also the other element, the final element of that part that I don't like is there's a panel that shows that Shiva did beat the shit out of David at some point during her pregnancy, but I don't like any origin where Shiva doesn't complete her revenge. Even back in the 70s, she did spare Guano Cravat, but there was a feeling of, and my revenge ended here, and I never thought about Carolyn again. And my goal was completed, and I had to figure out what to do next with my life. So the new origin saying, no, actually, she just sort of forgot about her revenge, let the guy who did the revenge go, and but still misses Carolyn every day. It makes her look like an asshole and like a dumbass, and it just makes her it again, it steals away from a lot of the things that make Shiva unique, because like every single character in the DC universe is defined in some way by their past, especially by past tragedies. Shiva was created by a past tragedy, but at some point she reached a level of just detaching herself from that tragedy that allowed her to become even stronger. To say that no, actually, she was sexually assaulted. She never killed the guy who did it, even though she had every chance to do it, and she still thinks about the person that she killed every day. It's like, well, that is a whole mess. Like, that's a bunch of absolutely messy shit that doesn't do her character any good. Like, it doesn't make her deeper. It doesn't make her more interesting. It just makes her a sad sack. It just steals her agency in her own story, and it's a mess. It's an absolute mess.
And I think as well for me, I'm not like as invested in Lady Shiva as you are, obviously, because I don't think anybody in the world is. But the thing that really, really bothers me about this is this entire genetic predestination thing that they have going in that arc. Like, yeah, like Carolyn and Sandra were like martial arts prodigies. Why? Because they had like the kung fu gene. Because like David Kane sees that, even though she's not fully trained yet, and he's like, "Oh, she's obviously going to give me a child." Which will become the greatest martial artist in the world. And I'm like, what the fuck are you talking about, man? Like, this is not how genetics work. This is not how martial arts work. Like, and also the thing that you only touched upon a little bit, the thing that where she's happy about, like Carolyn dying, or she claims so anyway, which is this, oh, she probably was like always like fucked up. It's this natural born killer thing, you know. It was always like lurking beneath the surface that she was always going to become like an assassin and stuff like that. I hate stories like that usually. Like, you can do it well, but I don't think this was particularly good. I mean,
No.
obviously it wasn't because of the whole sexual assault angle, but yeah, man, please no.
So, speaking of genes, one of the things I do like, one of the things that always makes me laugh, is when someone points out that for all of David's talk about how, well, the greatest assassin in the world had to come from my seed, yuck, uh, the funniest thing I've seen is when people point out that Cassandra is basically a mini Shiva. Like, she is exactly physically the same, and she looks the same and everything. And so the joke that I've seen a lot of people say is, wow, Sandra's genes just beat the shit out of David's. They
Yeah.
just kicked those genes got fucking rocked there,
Oh,
man.
it's that meme like, oh, I carried him for 9 months and he looks like his stupid dad, but in this case it's the other way around. And yeah, exactly. Kane is like,
uh,
oh, I went through all this trouble and she looks like her stupid mom.
that's like the one thing that brings me a little joy out of all that mess. But speaking of messes, here's the thing: you mentioned the assassin village. The
Yes.
assassin village thing came from Gail Simone's Bird of Prey, and it came right after that origin, that whole thing. And there's a panel where, because the whole deal is that Dinah, as part of like a Freaky Friday situation, not really,
Yep. Yep.
but
Yep.
they're
Yep. Yep.
trading lives, and Dinah goes to the place that trains Shiva. And the place that trains Shiva is like this very stereotypical Southeast Asian village where people are trading, always training like the next Lady Shiva.
Yeah.
And they say that, well, Sandra was here from where she was like 5, and we beat her ass daily until she could beat our asses. And that goes back into some of the whole faded stuff, which we don't like the
Yep.
idea of she was always going to be the Lady Shiva. It's like, come on, man, come on.
Yeah.
But
Like, I understand why Gail did this story. It's not like it's that whole thing with the White Canary as well. Like, oh yeah, like Dinah has to face uh, the ruthless, like the anti version of herself. She has to face like a version of herself that is like basically without any kind of remorse or stuff like that. And yeah, I understand why the setup exists, but it's, yeah, as you say,
it's too much faded guy, and it's also fuck, what was I gonna say? Uh, it also it's something that I think is very, it's a problem with modern comics. I think at some point in the history of comics and the history of media, the idea that a normal woman could become something like Lady Shiva in just a short span of time became impossible to accept. So you get the situation where it's like, oh no, she was always a prodigy, or oh no, she was raised from birth to be this, because the idea just, people weren't going to accept it. It's the same thing that happened with Cass. Like, people were not going to accept, oh, this tiny little girl can beat the shit out of everyone. So they had to come up with this pseudo scientific option to make it more palatable. So creating all these extra things of, well, she was always good at kicking people in the face, is sort of the way to make it feel earned, or any of
mm,
that other shit that I don't care about. I much prefer like a thematically strong story over something that uh, quote unquote makes more sense. But the
and
thing,
we are still talking about people in bat costumes who are swinging around and punching clowns. Like, you don't need to make this make sense. Like, this isn't the real world. We know this isn't the real world. I promise. Like,
yeah, it's cool, man, it's cool. But the thing is that that arc of Birds of Prey has a moment where Dinah from the village calls Shiva and she says, "Hey, man, so what the fuck's up with this village? Weren't you born and raised in Detroit?" And Shiva just kind of waves her hand and goes, well, that's not the whole story. And they leave it at that. And I had the opportunity to talk to Gail Simone about this. She was at a con like 4 years ago. I think it was pre-COVID, and I went over there and we actually got to talk about Shiva, because it turns out that Simone likes Shiva. Her husband likes Shiva a lot. Shout out to Rocket Spouse, great guy. And we got to talk a little bit about that. And she told me that when that new Batgirl origin appeared, she wanted to do this village thing, and she asked, "Will this have any problem, or will there be any problem with the other origin?" And she told me that they told her, "Look, don't worry about it."
mm,
Like, they kind of sandbagged that whole final arc of Batgirl a little bit. The guy was like, "Look, don't. It's not super serious." Uh, she's still a professional, so she still added like that extra bit to like try to connect them a little bit. But it made me think like, oh, even at the time, that had been too much. Like even at the time, they were thinking, "Ooh, maybe we don't want to talk about
Mm.
about this a bit too much," or maybe it was just Dan Didio trying to bury the fuck out of Cassandra even more.
Which he certainly tried more than a few
Oh,
times, yes.
absolutely. Maybe there was like a whole thing of, look, don't let. If we talk about that origin, you'll have to bring up Cassandra, and we're not talking about Cassandra right now. But like the whole point is that it's like it was a huge retcon. It was a huge mess. Even at the time, it just got kind of ignored. And nowadays, you have this situation where everyone knows that Shiva is Cassandra's mom. We don't really talk about how it happened because we
Mm.
don't want it to. It's not worth bringing it up.
No, you get things like that one panel that we had of her origin and the other, like a couple of years ago, which was just her fucking David Kane, and there was
Yeah.
like no context to that whatsoever. It was like yeah, you were sort of conceived of under bad circumstances, and like we're not going to go into it because it's nasty.
Yeah.
Um,
But
but
we are
I
going to go into it in a couple of months.
Yes, we are absolutely going into it because Cass and Shiva are currently having their buddy cop adventures in Cass's current series,
Hmm.
which is really going into the weeds of their relationship, like more than any series has before. I would say, like even more than the original Batgirl Volume One.
Yep. And in a couple of months, we're going to have two whole issues dedicated to the definitive origin of Lady Shiva. And I'm not gonna say terrified because I trust I trust Tate Brombal. I trust that he will do something good and something respectful. But I am still like, do we really need to? Do we need to? Every time that they have added new stuff to her origin, it has ended up with some way. Every time they try to make a new origin, it ends up being kind of inferior to the one that involves a guy called Guano Cravat.
Well, I mean, what if those two issues that are coming up are gonna be like the big Guano Cravat revival story? Like, not that he comes back, but that we like get the full story between him and Shiva. No, actually, no.
So
Let's not.
we'll see. But yeah, those
Yeah,
are
we'll
my
see.
two. Those are my two retcons. It's like one I love, one that I think this is how retcons should go, and one that I go, I would very much prefer that you hadn't done that.
I think the thing that Gail said is she talked about this fairly recently on social media, where somebody was asking her about something X-Men related. Like she's currently writing the Uncanny X-Men series, and somebody asked her about some minutiae from the last 10 years. And Gail's response was, if I don't like it, then I'm not going to reference it. Like, it basically, she's not going to go out and say that it's retconned, but it is in all effective means it is retconned because she's not going to use it. I don't remember what it was in that context, but it was something that was fairly, like, not terribly good, I thought, even at the time. So I think she sort of just has that attitude that if you don't like a particular story beat, then you can just ignore it going forward instead of doing this big, oh, we're going to change this. Ooh, retcons, cosmic waves are altering my origin. Ooh, you know?
Yep.
So, yeah. Elvis, are you still here?
Yeah, I've been here for a while. I just don't really care about Cass. So I was waiting for you guys to finish up.
Listening to Lady Shiva talk. So, Judge, I had one question before we leave the Lady Shiva origin thing. Was it Kelly Puckett's original intention to have Lady Shiva be Cass's mother?
Oh boy, this is another one fun story. Uh, for the longest time, I thought no, not really. Maybe there was like a little. I think Puckett was more interested in making a story about two completely unrelated people who were still able to find some kind of connection.
Hmm.
But a couple of years ago on social media, we talked with the editor of the run at the time, and he confirmed that, well, it was one of the things that was floated around the office. We
Right.
thought, yeah, this was Joseph Illich, the editor. one of the editors of that run. Great guy, by the way.
Oh, right. He's the
And
guy who writes the Shadow Cabinet.
yeah, fantastic dude. And he told us that it was something that they had discussed even at the time. They had been like, "Hey, who should be her mom?" And apparently, someone, he wouldn't say, he didn't mention who, but one of the things I was throwing around, well, wouldn't it be cool if it was just Lady Shiva? And Puckett never went there, but I think he set up enough connection between the two that you could sort of, yeah, well, I wouldn't blame anyone for reading through those whole 73 issues and thinking, oh, this was always going to be the plan. It was absolutely not going to be the plan because they changed writers. But I do feel like, okay, something was there and it could have happened even back then. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's like it.
It's interesting because Puckett was really playing the long game with David Kane. Like, he introduced David Kane before Cass ever appeared in the comics even. So he was sort of setting him up, and definitely he was always going to be Cass's dad, obviously. Like, that was the... If you don't remember, if you weren't around back in the time when Cass was introduced, that was actually introduced as a mystery plot. Who is Batgirl was like a big thing. And I remember going on, like, it wasn't social media at the time, but it was like, fucking live journal and stuff like that. There were so many people speculating about who the new Batgirl was going to be because they weren't telling, and obviously her costume was designed so you couldn't tell. And people were like fucking betting on it, and there were bets like all across, like every female character from the Batman mythos was being guessed at. Obviously, nobody guessed that it would be Cass because she'd only been in like one comic before that, or something like that, or two, as a very minor character.
Yeah. I know
but
that
yeah.
I know that you lost $20 because you bet it was going to be Leslie Tompkins.
There were people who were thought that it was going to be like fucking Silver St. Cloud. I shit you not. I remember. I wish I could find this through the Wayback Machine because there was like a page with how many people had guessed on various female characters. You could guess, like, I think it's going to be this person. Obviously, most people were guessing on Barbara or Huntress. Which is sort of turned out to be Huntress in a way because, like, that's how Cass got the costume. Huntress tried being Batgirl for like 5 minutes during No Man's Land, and Batman told her to basically stop it because this was the era when he really hated Huntress, and she ended up just junking the costume, and that's just Cass just found it and just put it on and became Batgirl. So yeah, interesting stuff. I guess I'm going to take things from here on out and talk about a retcon from the other company. Let's talk about the Marvel retcon for once. So Marvel isn't quite as famous for its retcons because they don't tend to make like a big deal out of them in the same way. They tend to sort of be more subtle, that unless you were familiar with the character, then you obviously could tell, but like it's not always obvious. But I think that we should just at least mention, we're not going to go totally into the weeds, but we're going to talk a little bit about the John Byrne Superman reboot in 1986. We already mentioned it before. So John Byrne in 1986 was one of the most highest paid artist writers in the business. He was highly acclaimed after his run on Fantastic Four and other things for Marvel. And DC baited him over to do Superman. And he basically was given very, very free hands to start over Superman from the beginning. And he was also given a very large amount of editorial autonomy, so he didn't actually need to respond. Like, he wasn't responsible to anybody except himself, as long as he did Superman for DC. And this obviously resulted in the miniseries called Man of Steel, which was very much influenced by the Richard Donner movies with Christopher Reeve to a large extent. Like, a lot of the stuff in that miniseries that reintroduced Superman, it was very much taken from the movies at the time. The first two movies, I should say, not the third and fourth one. and it was sort of this more grounded Superman. Obviously, his powers were greatly reduced. There were no more. There were no more extra Kryptonians, no Phantom Zone. A bunch of his goofier villains were toned down a lot. So like Brainiac became like he wasn't an intergalactic conqueror. He was like a mentalist on Earth who had like big mental powers, and he was maybe possessed by an alien? Question mark. Stuff like that. It was very much a toned down take on Superman. If it happened today, we would probably go like, "Oh, this is clearly made to be turned into like a Netflix series or something like that," because it kind of has that energy, you know.
Is that
Um,
ultimate Superman energy?
it is very yeah, kind of like uh, it's not there's not a big attitude change. He does humanize Superman a little bit more than he was in the Bronze Age, not terribly much, but like there's a bit more. Like his parents being alive is a big factor in humanizing him, obviously. And this would be the template for Superman for a very long time going forward until the early 2000s. Roughly around the time when that Lady Shiva story happened, we had Jeff Loeb do Superman, and he brought back a lot of the Silver Age stuff in a rather clumsy story that we're not going to talk about now. But I grew up with the John Byrne Superman. It was a big relaunch of the comic book in Sweden. Like they made a lot of bells and whistles about it. Like, oh, here's this new modern version of Superman, and I mean, I read it and I liked it pretty good. As I got older, I think I started to see sort of where the wheels come off that version. I don't think that it's very good at like setting up a world. I think it's really is more feels like more like watching a TV series. Um, it has good parts, but it also has some parts that I understand why they changed back because they're so iconic. Like people love the weird stuff. Like people like Supergirl. Like it was really weird that he really didn't want to do Supergirl, and he did this the Matrix protoplasm Supergirl from another universe who eventually merged with a dying Satanist lady called Linda, and then they were infused with the power of an angel, and then they separated, and then Linda became Supergirl, and yeah,
Yeah, and then they got published in another company.
yep, and they made Dan DiDio so angry that he decided to bring back like the Silver Age Supergirl in yeah, didn't go well. So how do you guys feel about this? The idea of rebooting Superman, like from the ground up, because this was like a total erasure of the slate. We were really starting over from the beginning. Elvis, do you have anything about this?
Well, let's see. When it comes to like starting from scratch with Superman, it's really difficult. Man of Steel, especially, when you mention like Ultimate Superman, that really nails it on the head because you get a lot of stuff like Krypton became. And kind of still is really influenced by like how he portrayed Krypton, cold, sterile, technocratic, that kind of thing.
Mm.
And that's not too interesting. I think it kind of just pulls away from like the more fantastical stuff, and we've only really I think relatively recently started getting pushback on that. But overall, Man of Steel, it as like its own kind of story. I think it is weaker than Year One because Year One, even though it does cover some distance, it has a flow to it. While Man of Steel, to
Mm.
me, I feel it's very segmented. It feels like okay, this is just an overview, and it's just I don't know. I'm not really
It's
interested.
choppy, I would say. Yeah.
Exactly, yes. But overall, I'm fine with it overall.
Do you what do you think about like the new Luthor, for example? Like he's not a super scientist; he's a businessman. He's not even that smart. He just pays other people to be very smart for him. How do you feel about that change? Because
Well,
that's
it is pretty dull. Again, I think like the big thing about Burn is that you said like it was like stripping it down, stuff like that, but it's more of like a dulling. Like a lot of the stuff happens is it becomes more blunt, more bland, and Luthor
mm,
is definitely a part of that. But I don't mind the businessman aspect. I think that it's just a lot of other writers after Burn took the businessman angle and were able to make really great use of it with his other mad scientist stuff. I think it actually works
Mm.
really well hand in hand with that scientist stuff. That other writers were like, okay, this is fun. These are both fun things you can do a lot of fun stuff with, And so
Yeah,
with
like
Burn, it just feels like
exactly.
he just feels free standard, too standard.
Mm. It really has that feeling of like, oh, let's make this like into something that we could turn into a TV series, right? And it's kind of that energy it has to it. Um, uh, but what was I gonna say? Obviously, the Brainiac thing is like that's a very big thing. Like it took them very many years to go back to the intergalactic conqueror Brainiac, and I don't know why he felt that that in particular was something that he needed to retcon because he uses Mr. Mixius Pedalic as he is. Like he's literally just a Silver Age character again. So, Judge, what's your relationship to the post-crisis Superman, if any?
A long time ago, when I was a little kid, my mom actually bought me a bunch of Superman issues, and one of them was the debut of the new Brainiac.
Mm.
And my little 7-year-old brain thought, oh, wow, the first appearance of Brainiac. This comic is gonna be worth so much.
Yeah.
7-year-old me was kind of a dumbass, but yeah, I didn't realize that there was another Brainiac before that. I thought that, oh, that's just Brainiac. That's just how it happens. Which just goes to show how absolute Superman Man of Steel was in terms of starting stuff from scratch. We talked earlier about how like Hawkworld was also gonna be the start from scratch until they got cold feet. And meanwhile with Superman, thanks to Burns, like Cachet and Cloud, it was like, no, 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 let's just do what he says, do what he wants.
Yeah.
And yeah, I agree also with always that it's like a lot of things were like the ideas that he brought to the table, other people later took and ran with a lot better than him. Like I love Businessman Luthor. I think that's genius. And
Mm.
that is a way to make the character a lot more villainous in a modern way, but also in an organic way. But it's true that there's a couple of great moments in that run for Luthor, but it doesn't get huge until like other people start playing with the concept. So
Mm.
yeah, it's like I like the new origin, and I can definitely see how it influences like everything else about Superman ever, like the Kens being alive and such.
Mm.
But it's like it would have he could have ended his run a bit earlier, maybe. There's a couple of things there that are very Burn in a bad way.
It does kind of spin its wheels a little bit, but I think it's interesting that both of you mentioned this thing about Krypton. If you, for example, look at Zack Snyder's version of Krypton from the Man of Steel movie, is very, very much inspired by Byrne's take because you have Jor-El being like the first guy who wants to have like a natural birth in like centuries. That's straight out of Byrne. The entire thing with him being like a guy who's ruled by emotions, and all these other Kryptonians are these like stuffy shirts and stuff like that. Even though the aesthetics are, of course, totally different, but you can really tell that the influence is still sort of lingering with the entire idea of Krypton in some of the versions that we get today. Well, I will give Zack Snyder though the benefit that he did put giant dragonflies in his version, which is way too fucking metal for John Byrne to ever have put it in. Like it would have been something much more boring.
Absolutely.
But yeah, I think I mean Superman is a difficult one, right? Because everybody knows Superman's origin, and you can't really change it that much because people are just going to go like that. That's just one of those cases where it's just gonna rubber band back eventually, right?
Yeah, I think that with Superman, the best thing that you can do is you can keep his origin, you can keep the broad strokes of it, and then what you need to do is something like what happened with Captain America, where the origin is the same, but suddenly he finds himself in a new world.
Mm.
Suddenly it's the same origin, but instead of happening in 1939, now it's happening in 1980. When was Man of Steel? 87?
86.
86. Right. It's like the origin is more or less the same. There are details that are different, there are things that are different, but the world has changed. And so what you can explore is how do we do the same origin but in current time in this modern world? What changes if the same thing that happened happens now? And that's where you get Man of Steel, that's where you get the current absolute Superman stuff going
Mm.
on. That's where you get these kind of things. It's like, and
And,
sure, it can go good or bad, but that's kind
yeah.
of the way I think.
And also, you get comics like Superman Birthright, which doesn't really change the origin that much, but it focuses a lot on a period of Clark's backstory that isn't explored that much in like the Byrne version. So it goes more into his years as a teenager in Smallville, for example. So which you can obviously redefine the character. Like they made an entire TV series out of that on television. It was called Smallville, where he never wore a costume except for maybe the last episode. But like you can focus on other things and you can delve into other aspects of the character. Like there are big blank spaces that you can do that aren't just between the gentleman Krypton is doomed panel, and then the rocket goes off, and then he's in Kansas, and then he's teenager, and then he's Superman. Like there's a lot of stuff you can fit into that time frame.
You can put mermaids in there.
You could, have Clark fuck a mermaid. Like, why not? Obviously, great story. Maybe. So we have talked about John Byrne's Superman, which is still a fairly well-regarded story. I think. Like, it's not really something that people get inordinately. I know that the tide has swung a lot towards people thinking that Bronze Age Superman was a lot better before Byrne, which is like that's fair, but I still don't think that it's the most hated retcon. Do you guys want to talk about Spider-Man Year One?
Yes, please.
Go ahead.
Please.
So in the late 1990s, John Byrne was lured back to Marvel by this. He had been ruining Wonder Woman for a while at this point. We're not gonna talk about Donna Troy in this episode because we're gonna be here like all night. It's just gonna be Donna Troy talk. But yeah, John Byrne comes back to Marvel. He's been ruining Wonder Woman and ruining Donna Troy really hard. He comes back. He goes like, "I want to do Spider-Man." Marvel is like, "Yes, John, you are a big famous comic book writer." And then John Byrne says, "I want to do Spider-Man's origin." And they say, "That's already pretty much covered." And then John Byrne says, like, probably the most insane thing that I've ever read from him in an interview, which was like, I feel that the Steve Ditko Spider-Man stories have aged terribly and they are no longer relevant for today's audience. I'm going to update his origin and make it better.
Bruh.
That's fucking insane. Like, how... Like, I understand that Byrne is pretty self-aggrandizing. Like, he's pretty sure of himself. But, like, goddamn, man. Like... Oh.
Bruh.
So John Byrne, back at Marvel, he gets editorial approval to do a limited series called Spider-Man Year One, which will then play into his ongoing Spider-Man title, which he's going to do after it. And it's not every issue of the Ditko Spider-Man, but it covers like all of the major issues. So it sort of covers the appearances of like the origin issue, obviously, the appearances of the major foes and stuff like that, the Green Goblin story and stuff like that. But what John Byrne does, so this is what you talked about before, Judge. What he does is that he updates the story, so now it takes place in like the 1980s or something. I think he says 1987 at some point.
Cheeky.
Yes, and obviously he modernizes it, so that people have computers, so that the kids don't need to feel like, oh, this is so old-fashioned. He updates it he removes all of the pop culture references that reference stuff from the 60s that Ditko had, because obviously that's going to take you out of the story. So instead we have these 80s celebrity references, which is very important. And then he fucking goes in and like changes things. I think the most blatant thing that he changes, and you may have heard about this, is that what Byrne does is that he has Dr. Octopus is the guy running the experiment that creates the spider, right? So their two origins are now the same origin. They get irradiated at the same time, which is like a pretty big thing because it sort of locks in Doc Ock as his major nemesis. There is a bunch of minor stuff. The most insane thing I think you've also heard about, and that is that John Byrne, he explains to us a detail that everybody's been wondering about since the 60s. He explains that the Sandman, Flint Marko, and Norman Osborn, they're actually cousins because they have the same hairstyle.
Huh?
This was very, very important. He devotes several panels of an issue to this, to explain that their weird, like, cornrow hair means that these two men are cousins. It's not important for any plot reason. It doesn't play into the story in any way. He also devotes half an issue to explain why the spider emblem on Spider-Man's costume is blue for one of the Ditko issues, and Byrne is like, it's very important that I explain this. It can't have been a coloring error. Obviously, he was using like an emergency suit at the time. We're going to go into details about this. This series is just so fucking navel-gazing. Like, this is retconning at its worst. This is going into details that nobody gives a shit about, things that aren't important. It also makes Spider-Man's... these stories are not better than the Ditko stories. Like, absolutely not. In no fucking way. Nobody's gonna pick this version, ever. And it was forgotten so fucking fast. Like, the interesting thing is, this was running at the same time that Kurt Busiek was doing Untold Tales of Spider-Man. Which is this little series that sort of interweaves between the existing Ditko stories. Totally incompatible with John Byrne's version. And I think somebody at some point asked Byrne about this, and he was like, no, those Untold Tales stories, they don't exist. Like, only my version exists.
Of course.
They were running at the same time as well. Like, these were comics on at the stands at the same time.
Yeah. I do have a question. That I want to figure out. At the time, do you know if Marvel was hyping this year one thing as like, this is going to be the real origin of Spider-Man? Were they hyping it the same way that DC had hyped Man of Steel? Or was it always like, this is going to be like an Elseworlds thing and we'll figure out what happens if people like it or not?
No, at the time it was definitely meant to be the updated origin, because when John Byrne was done with this, he went in and he did a run on Amazing Spider-Man with Howard Mackie as co-writer. And that series is very obviously based on year one, because there are characters come back from that series into the ongoing and stuff like that. And they reference the thing with Doc Ock being connected to Peter, that they got their powers at the same time and all of that stuff. But after that, the pushback on this was, as far as I could understand, pretty heavy even at the time. And it got dropped pretty fast after that. Like, it did not last long into the early 2000s.
No.
And I think I'm just going to add one more thing.
Yeah, sure.
The thing that happened in the early 2000s as well was that Marvel was like, what if we do this, but we do it in a different universe? And then we got Ultimate Spider-Man out of it with Brian Michael Bendis and Mark Bagley, which is essentially the same idea, but it's a different canon, so you can just do whatever you want with it, and that turned out to be really successful. So I think that was sort of the nail in the coffin for the Byrne version, because like, why would you want to keep that when you now have this other version that you can rely on instead, like in the other universe?
Yep. Though it's also funny because like, this whole thing started because Byrne says that disco stuff is outdated and such. But you remember, for example, the whole thing about what Ditko wanted the original backstory for the Green Goblin to be, that he was going to be someone, a complete stranger, someone
Yeah,
that had nothing to do. And so you telling me that Byrne not only kept the connection between goblins, but also added more connections to other villains and more connections between the villains. It's like, oh yeah, Burn is the kind of nerd that we were talking about an hour ago. The kind of nerd that sees something and says, "Well, this doesn't make sense. I am going to make it make sense."
yeah. He definitely the Green Goblin, like he's very transparent about it that the Green Goblin is Norman Osborn because Norman Osborn is a character in that series even outside of his Goblin persona. And he, I think, even creates like one of the villains as sort of like a prototype. I think he feeds some guy like prototype Goblin serum or something like that Spider-Man fights in that series as well. It's something stupid. So and of course he goes into the thing with Sandman, and I think that I don't want to reread this series, but I think that Norman Osborn hires the Sandman, so that's also a retcon to the Sandman's first appearance. Like Norman Osborn hires him because like you're my criminal cousin, you should come in here and do like criminal things for me because I can't get my hands dirty. And obviously this is all stuff that happened after Ditko's run. Like the Norman Osborn thing was a Stan Lee idea that happened later. So yeah, it's such a fucking mess. Like. Elvis,
It's
have you
such
read
a
the series? Do you like it?
It's the first time I'm hearing about it, but it sounds good.
Good.
which goes to show how popular it was,
Thank God.
which was not at all.
What do you think that John Byrne is superior to Steve Ditko in telling Spider-Man's origin?
Probably not. I don't know.
Tastes are subjective, but probably not.
Probably not.
Probably not. Yeah, no, it's one of those attempts that they've made to change something that just got so unpopular that it just was buried. And pretty quickly buried as well. I think the series ran in like, oh shit, may have been like 97 or something like that. And it was definitely not referenced anymore after the year 2000. So it was a brief life for this fantastic comic, Spider-Man Year One. There is also a John Byrne Hulk Year One, but that's just a single annual where he sort of retells the Hulk's origin. I don't know what he changes in it, but it's probably something that he felt was like outdated about the Hulk's origin. Oh,
It also goes to show how much how much amicable Marvel DC relations were back then, where Marvel could just put out a comic called Year One, and that wasn't a problem. Like they didn't have to
several
come
comics.
up. Yeah, they
Yeah,
didn't even have to come up with another name. They didn't have to come up with a new name for them. It was like, no, this is now the accepted name for any new origin stories across the board for both companies.
yep.
And nobody
Apparently,
complained. There weren't any lawsuits. Nobody bitched. It was just, this is gonna be it now.
well, the fans bitched a lot. Honestly, I don't
But
think many people would go to bat for the Spider-Man Year One. Honestly,
no.
oh my goodness. So I have another retcon, which is actually two retcons, and it's actually not a retcon, it's actually a bunch of them. And I think that both of you are pretty familiar with these two. But we're back at DC, and
Mhm.
we are going to talk a little bit, at least, about Maxwell Lord and Amanda Waller.
Oh, oh. You want to make us sad?
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you want to make us cry?
So, post-crisis, the DC Universe saw a bunch of new titles being launched, and we got the revamped Justice League by Keith Giffen and J.M. DeMatteis, Kevin Maguire, which had Maxwell Lord. He was sort of a yuppie financer. He was kind of a bad guy originally, but he very quickly got over that, and then became just sort of their financer backup guy. And over in Suicide Squad by John Ostrander and Luke McDonald, you had Amanda Waller, who was the handler of the Suicide Squad. She was a civilian. She was very much like not a super character or like an. She wasn't a special agent. She was just a woman who was very, very good at handling obstinate people. And over time, both of these characters have sort of been slowly transformed, both in backstory and in their present depiction, into being like pretty much unrepentant villains. We have the Maxwell Lord was obviously outed. His big villain outing was in the Infinite Crisis thing, where he shot Blue Beetle through the head. And Amanda Waller has sort of been slipping and sliding for a very long time, but
Oh man, I just want to mention this. Yeah, Max Lord is back to running Intergang for some freaking reason into New Gods, and Amanda Waller, she took over an entire universe.
she
Yep.
It's
absolutely
insane.
did. She
Primitive evil.
she reached the peak of her her well-known hatred for superheroes, which spoiler alert did not exist originally. She took over the DC universe in Absolute Power, which involved her
Oh,
like
I was talking about War for Earth 3. I don't give a shit about Absolute Power.
no, but Absolute Power, where she
War for Earth 3 was pretty good. I like it.
what was which one was that?
That was War for Earth 3. It was a crossover between I think Teen Titans and
Oh,
Nightwing and Suicide
I
Squad.
haven't read.
It was pretty good. I liked it. And then like the end of it, she just takes over Earth 3.
Oh
Dick
right,
Vader.
is that
Pretty
the
good.
one where people are like, oh yeah, that was probably like the Earth 3 version of Amanda Waller because she's like actually evil
I
or
don't
something like
know.
that? I don't know, but people have said that. Yeah, but in Absolute Power, she just took over like DC Earth and like made deals with Trigon and stuff like that, and it was very contrived and had this army of Amazos that sucked up powers left and right. Obviously, these two characters have been very, very heavily retconned from their original selves, incarnations, and intentions. How do you feel about this, Judge?
There's a funny thing about the thing about Maxwell Lord. I think that sort of the problem with some of these retcons is that if you put enough time between the last time a character was relevant and the moment that the character is made relevant again through a retcon, you're going to end up with a lot of people whose first contact with that character is the retcon. You're going
Yep.
to end up with a lot of people who will only know Max Lord from what the new comic is telling them about them. And I know that because I am that person.
Yep.
I knew about the Goofy JLA. I had never read it, even though it was like a pretty huge down here in my country at the time. But I had never read it because I wasn't really a Justice League, and I still am not. So when I saw Maxwell Lord, what I saw was, oh, he was the guy in the Justice League and turns out he's evil. Okay, cool. That makes sense, I guess, from what little I know. And then you go back and they say, oh, this was a bad idea.
Oh yeah, yeah. Ultimate Reed Richards. The Maker is a terrible idea. Bendis and Hickman are hacks, and that is. I'm sorry, but same thing. It was like people were like, "Oh, the Maker is one of the best super villains and comic villains in history." No, he's one of the worst ideas, the worst execute ideas ever written. And it's only like there was a retcon war going on about that. There was a retcon war because it was Hickman like, oh, let's retcon this, and then there was Joshua Hale Fieldcov going like, oh, we got to retcon that back, and then Hickman, the Bendis was like, we got to retcon that in again, and then Hickman was like, no, it's got to be this way, and Hickman got the last.
Was this bizarre back and forth where they were like, oh, but no, like Sue Storm was actually like superior to him in every way all of a while. She's just gonna casually
Yeah, it was actually
beat
like
his ass.
it was actually no, like Reed was always evil. No, wait, no, Reed wasn't always evil. Well, actually, he wasn't always evil, but he became evil. But no, actually, he was never evil. But oh no, he was evil all the time. But now he's redeemed. But no, actually, he was lying about being redeemed. Wait, he was actually redeemed. And like it's ridiculous. The Maker is a terrible idea. But Max Lord reminded me a lot of that. So go on.
Yeah, it's like if you for example, with the Maker, let's say that you have a reader who has only started reading Ultimates with the new run, which is pretty great. And their ideas of the Maker is just going to be, oh, what I'm reading in this run. They're not going to know all that context. They're not going to know all the stuff that went there. They're not going to know about the Retcon wars and dueling retcons and stuff.
Mm.
So you end up with these situations where the new version of the character, the Retcon version, ends up becoming the default one. And suddenly now everyone says, oh, Maxwell Lord is a Wonder Woman villain.
Yeah.
And that's what he's always been, right? And you gotta sit those people down and tell them, I was like you once. I
And
know what that
that's
feels like.
and that's also you. It's also this thing where if you use a bad version of a character in a very high profile story, that is often a version that gets fixated on. And I'm going to turn us back here a little bit and talk about Hush, because the Lady Shiva version who appears in Hush is probably how a lot of people first saw Lady Shiva. And she is such a fucking goofy ass klutz in that
Piece of
series.
shit.
She gets fucking beaten up by Talia with a folding chair, which is still the funniest panel I've ever seen. Like, this is some wrestling tier clown bullshit. And that was the first time a lot of readers saw Lady Shiva. And they're going to go like, oh, she's like this goofy assassin who is not terribly good at it because she gets like bodied by Talia. And you're like, but no, like, she has all of this backstory, you know? She has these good comics as well.
Yeah, it's also just the because that's just like a different version of character. But yeah, it's true that it's like if you retcon a character, it, it creates a sort of vicious cycle where you have a huge event and you want the event to sound huge. So one of the things you can do is just retcon a character to suddenly be revealed to be a bad guy or to suddenly be changed. And because it's a huge event, it's going to be a lot of people's first contact with that character.
Hmm.
And that means that that version of the character is going to be the de facto one. And yeah, if it's something like Hush, I'm sure that Hush was a lot of people's first contact, not just with Chiba, but with characters like Talia, with characters like fucking. I would say even with I was probably people's first contact with Jason Todd in some
Oh,
cases.
yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure there were a lot of people who pretty much the first time they read about some of the Bat villains and that as well. Like, they probably knew who they were, but it was probably their first comic with them as well. So yeah, and this thing with the big event thing and the bad version, like Scarlet Witch, like House of M,
Oh yeah.
disassembled, you
Oh
know,
boy. Oh
that
boy.
was
Well, you
that
can
was
only.
that was an albatross like around the neck of that character for a very long time, and it sort of still comes up from time to time, but not as much now. I will say that they have sort of kind of shaken it off ish. I mean, I'm sure we'll see a return to it eventually, but
Progress.
that's again this case where it's this big story. Like House of M was a huge story. It still is a huge story. Marvel still promotes those trades and they reference it in other media and stuff like that. And you saw that, and that was your first exposure to Scarlet Witch, and you're like, oh, you're like, she's that crazy woman who rewrites reality. Like, yeah, that's obviously it.
And you can also see Burns' fingers all over that thing, even if he didn't write it.
Yeah, no, but he started it. He definitely started it. But it's very. I think the depressing one with me is Amanda Waller because I think that John Ostrander's version of Amanda Waller is so cool that she's like a non-powered woman who just rose up through the ranks by sheer gumption, and that she's actually like a nice person working in the U.S. government. Which is like something that the modern Amanda Waller is absolutely not a nice person. Like she fucking hates everybody she works with, and she's like happy to blow people's heads up, like
Yeah,
which is like
absolutely.
it's. And that's a much less interesting character because that's a character who's like a stock character, right? That's the evil government bad guy character that
Yep.
you can. There are 50 million of those
Yep.
everywhere.
Yep. Yeah, and it's also a bummer because that version of Waller ends up getting used for movies and for shows,
Yeah.
and suddenly that's all she's ever been.
Yep.
Like I remember, I went to see the first Suicide Squad movie in theaters, and a lot of people talk about all the stuff that they don't like about that movie. And the thing that the moment I realized this is trash, up until that point, it had been this is entertaining trash. This is dumb, but I'm having like I'm not bored and I'm not offended or angry. The only moment that pissed me the fuck off about that movie was that moment where Amanda just shoots her entire control team
Oh
and makes
yeah,
like
yeah,
a
yeah,
comment
yeah, yeah.
about, oh, we can't leave any witnesses, and I'm like, fuck you, you motherfucker. Like
Yep.
there was a whole deal about how Amanda cares for her control team in Suicide Squad. There were characters in that control team that started like in issue one and were still there by the end.
Mm.
Like she absolutely cared for every single one of those people. That's like the big difference. The big difference to me is that the Waller in Ostrander's run is written as someone who cares about her people, who believes that some people are genuinely trying to redeem themselves and that she should do her best to support those people. The rest can go fuck themselves. And current Amanda Waller is someone defined by not caring about anything, not caring about her
Yeah.
people, not caring about consequences. Be like, we gotta do the mission and we gotta do the thing. And it's like that is a flat ass, boring ass, dumb shit character. And I am so sad that you are wasting Viola Davis's time with this.
Yeah. Yeah, she's become like fucking what's his name? Henry Peter Gyrick, that the Marvel character who only
Oh,
exists to be like the asshole government guy who comes in and goes like, superheroes are actually evil. We're just work for the government. I don't care about any of you. I'm gonna send you on a suicide mission. Like
yeah.
she's just become a stereotype. And I hated like I read that Dreamer miniseries where she's in the Suicide Squad. That was sort of like a prequel to the Absolute Power thing,
Right,
and that was I I think it's great that the actress who played Dreamer gets to write comics,
right.
but the depiction of Amanda Waller in that series was fucking terrible. Because like what she does in that series is that she holds Dreamer's family hostage, and she has like an assassin team on them, and that like if Dreamer isn't complying with working for the Suicide Squad, she's going to murder her family, who are like civilians just living somewhere. And I'm like, I
No,
don't like this. This is bad.
no.
That was really just ruined an otherwise entertaining series for me, unfortunately. Oh goodness. Yeah. And the a retcon can be good if it leads to better stories than what you had before. That's often the sort of the benchmark. Like, if does this lead to a better story?
Yeah.
And I think in Amanda Waller's case, it has not led to any better stories. I cannot think of any good stories with like Evil Waller that were like fun or worthwhile.
Yeah. There's nothing there for her character. It hasn't improved her in any way. It hasn't made her more interesting or more in depth. It has just provided other characters around her with a stock villain to rail against, and it sucks ass.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're absolutely right that the thing with retcons, what I would say would be like my final word on retcons is whether they're necessary or not, whether you think they need to be done or not, whether you think that you need to order something or you need to explain something away, you should make sure that what you said, what you're writing is better than what you're retconning. That what you're
Mhm.
writing is adding some extra layer of thematic depth, that what you're writing is adding an extra layer of character depth, that what you're writing is doing something better than what came before. And if you can't guarantee any of that, if you can't come at it in a way that says, well, I'm going to do something more, if I'm not going to add to stuff, just don't.
Yeah.
Just don't. Just focus on the future, focus on the present. Uh just don't.
Yeah, it's weird, and also I think that there is also an aspect where you make something more complex, and I think this is something that Mike Gold talks about in one of these articles, is that the more complexity you add to something through retcons, the harder it becomes to use for future creators and also for the readers. Like, readers are just going to like sort of lose patience with you, like the more involved and complicated you make something with adding stuff to it. And I think that a very good example of this is if you look at the Phoenix over at Marvel. Like, if somebody asked me today to explain what the current lore of the Phoenix is, I would probably feign death and hope that they would go away rather than try to get into it, because it's so fucking convoluted. Like, all of this shit with parallel realities and time travel and self-fulfilling prophecies and shit like that, it's so complicated that it's just like, how are you going to use it? And the funny thing is, I've seen a lot of people who have complained about, there is a Phoenix solo series currently on the stands, and I've seen a lot of people who have been like very upset about the fact that it doesn't really go very deep into the Phoenix lore. Like, why are you not referencing this and this and this and this? And the reason that they're not is because it's so complicated, and it doesn't really, probably doesn't enhance the story terribly much, because
Yeah.
they're trying to like tell a story in the present that isn't going back into the origin constantly again. But now you're in this situation, you're in this bear trap with the Phoenix, that there is so much shit in the lore, and it's very, if you ignore it, then people are going to complain, and if you use it, people are going to complain. Like, what are you going to do about it? Except not write a Phoenix comic, obviously. It's like, but Judge, please explain to us the current state of the Phoenix lore in Marvel.
So there's this room. There's this room that may or may not be a reference to an old Cream song.
I think probably definitely yes.
And apparently it's like really hot in that room.
The
And
somewhat warm room, is that
yeah,
its name?
no, that was retcon later. This is like the really hot room, but it's
Yeah.
not a sauna, and apparently stuff happens in there.
Mm,
And that's it. That's what I know about the current status
that's
of
it. The
Phoenix.
shenanigans occur in this magical place.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think this is like one of those cases where it's just become too unwieldy for its own good.
Yeah.
And because again, then if you use this, then people are gonna, like, new readers and people who have maybe not read all of these previous comics are just gonna be confused and like maybe even put off by it. And if you don't use it, then the people who did read those comics are going to endlessly pester you about it on social media.
Hmm.
And I think it doesn't really behoove anything to keep retconning things just endlessly like that. Like, just settle on something or stop going back to the origin. Like, just do stories in the present or something. I don't know.
Just do new stuff.
Elvis, what do you think about the Phoenix?
Oh, I don't care about the Phoenix at all.
I mean,
I don't think about her at all.
yes, exactly. Have you read Mo Phoenix, the parody?
Oh yeah, I mean it was okay.
Yeah.
I like the other
So,
ones better.
the everything is illuminated
Yeah.
and then it
That,
dies. Yeah, but
that.
that's because that Illuminated wrote that, and he's so fucking funny.
Oh yeah, but Phoenix was done by what MGK or things. Right?
Yeah, that
Yeah.
was the other guy,
Yeah,
exactly.
that was I don't know. It was over the top. I think too over the top.
I think the best part of, like the funniest part of a Phoenix is, I have that clipped somewhere. It's that page of Doctor Strange fighting magic in limbo, and all of the demons go blunt, blunt.
Ah, shit.
Ah, shit!
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, no, everything is illuminated and then it dies is so funny because it is a pretty incisive parody of the.
He understands what makes the story work and why it doesn't work. That's what
Yeah, he is absolutely on spot with like the Hickman cliches, like "fuck your charts, Tony." Like that entire page with Tony and Cap just discussing why the icons are what they are is just
I'm the
no.
H, right? No, that's Hawkeye.
It's like, why isn't Spider Woman the spider? Like, and it's so good. It's so funny.
It really is.
But yeah, so the Phoenix is one of those cases. I often bring this up, but I think that the X-Men property especially has a huge problem where every writer who comes on board, they want to do the Phoenix, they want to do Dark Phoenix, some iteration of that. They want to do Days of Future Past, something with the Sentinels. They want to revisit all of these old storylines again, and I think instead of just going forward with it, and I think especially with the Phoenix, it's just become to the point where it's just like I just roll my eyes when I see there's some kind of Phoenix thing happening. Like, oh my god. And it's also funny when you also have this thing that you mentioned before, Judge, where like different writers have different ideas about it because Jason Aaron was really trying to do something with the Phoenix in his Avengers run, and then the Krakoa thing happened, and they just totally fucking go. They just go, no, none of that stuff that Jason Aaron did doesn't matter. Like none of that is important. This is the real story. We're gonna tell you the real Phoenix story right now. Like fuck off, Echo. You're not the Phoenix anymore. Like you were never the Phoenix. Like okay, sure. Goodness. So
What
yeah,
an amazing thing comics are.
yeah. What a fantastic. Well, they're so magical, aren't they?
Yeah, how they reward engagement and long-term planning. Huh?
Exactly. I think I want to bring up another one of our favorite creators. I think we should talk a little bit about Mr. Jeff Johns.
I gotta
He,
say, out of the ones we've talked so far, his are probably the most clean.
yeah. So the big two with Jeff Johns are the Parallax one that Hal Jordan went evil because he had a space bug in him, and then there is the Flash one that Flash's mother was murdered by Zoom, the Reverse Flash, and that's why he became the Flash. Those are Jeff Johns' big contributions. How do you guys feel about those?
Well,
Elvis.
I wouldn't count the Zoom one as a retcon though. It's something that happens, like you mentioned with it's something that happens as part of like an ongoing storyline, and that could be resolved someday.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean it's literally like a retcon that happens in universe. Like
Exactly.
Zoom is like, yeah, I'm gonna change the timeline.
Exactly. His mom was alive. It's due to time travel that happens in the future. So the stories that her mother was alive and never not happened is that right as of like a certain point, Zoom went back, and so moving forward, she's never been alive. It's not. I wouldn't call
But
it a retcon though.
is it a good story though?
I don't know. It could have been.
It could have been, but it's not.
Yeah, because it has never been resolved.
Yeah.
They never tied it up. They could, in some point in the future, they could tie it off if they wanted to. I know, like the show had like this really dumb idea of like, oh, they try to turn it back, but oh no, his mother wanted to die because
Oh.
and some shit like that. The show was fucking terrible.
What?
Doesn't like the universe almost collapse because he tries to save his mother?
No, okay, see, that's the thing. People say that's because he's trying to save his mother, but no, because he time traveled without the cosmic treadmill and it destroyed the timeline. It's a different thing entirely. See, so the mom could still be saved, and they could tie that off someday. They could, right? So I wouldn't call it a retcon. I really wouldn't.
What about Parallax? What about the space bug?
I feel like there was more elegant ways of doing that. Mainly because I'm part of people that feel like killing off all the core and all that kind of stuff was pretty lame. And I don't like Cal Rayner. I think he's a lame motherfucker. I think he's my least favorite Lantern, honestly. Um, so I don't mind that at all, really. Like, it could have been done better, but I don't know. I'm glad that we can sweep that all under the rug so that
Are
Kyle
you
can
you were a
better.
card carrying Heat member?
I mean, I don't agree with their methods, but they got results.
Yeah. What do you think about Parallax, Judge?
It's another one of those things where I started Green Lantern on Rebirth, so I
Mm.
didn't have like the whole context for it.
Yeah.
But it definitely goes back to that idea of, well, you're trying to replace years of ongoing continuity and ongoing storytelling where maybe not all of it was planned and maybe not all of it was even good, but there was a story going on. And I think this also goes back to something that I think is important to note about retcons. I think that for the longest time, retcons were something that happened when people wanted to write around what they saw as inconsistencies or what they saw as things that could be fixed or could be touched. And the big retcons, the big continuity changes happened in big events. And at some point, probably in Green Lantern Rebirth, I would say that it's probably in Rebirth, there was a moment where people said, no, 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 actually, we can just do new continuities in smaller, for like one series. We can just do a huge, a crisis level change of the entire continuity of something only for Green Lantern and only for one particular aspect of Green Lantern. And that is a problem. And that
Mm.
is a problem because it opens the door to people who maybe they're not interested in doing like a huge reboot of the whole continuity, but they want to reboot this one character, this one part, this one little bit. I just want to go back. I just want to change it because I didn't like this or I didn't like that. And once you open that door, you can just retcon anything. Once you do that, once you say you can reboot an entire character's continuity and you can make the last 15 years of a character's continuity completely irrelevant in just one miniseries without having to retcon anything else. You don't have to reboot the entire universe. Once you do that, then what's stopping you from doing it with every character? What's stopping you from, like, instead of rebooting a whole universe, rebooting it piece by piece? First Green Lantern, then Flash, then this, then that, and suddenly everyone is getting rebooted, and then they're getting rebooted of the reboot, and good luck stopping that.
Yeah, it's sort of the beginning of this the era of the rock star creator in the 2000s, where a lot of the big two were a lot more open to having creators just come in and just doing whatever, like with stories didn't have to make any sense and didn't have to really fit into anything, which is great as long as the comics that they do are actually good, uh, which they are not always. But I'm going to say, perhaps somewhat surprisingly, that I don't think that the Parallax thing was really that bad. I think that Jeff Johns did a lot of things that were really bad uh, at the time with DC. Like, yeah, he made Doomsday Clock for one. Like, so obviously it's not the worst thing he's done. Uh, but yeah, I think I'm not terribly bothered by the Parallax thing. I think I thought it was a little bit stupid when it happened. Like, I think the thing that I bothered me the most about it was that it was like, oh, Hal is this innocent, blameless. Like, he's always been so innocent and pure. And I'm like, yeah, it's a little bit of a dumbing down of his character. Like, wants him to be a little bit too pure. But again, it's not something that super bothers me, honestly. We've talked about Doomsday Clock before, and we've talked about Three Jokers before, and that those comics bother me, but for different reasons. We're not going to talk about three Jokers tonight, by the way, if you're worried about it.
Phew.
Whew.
I can
But yeah,
barely handle one Joker.
yes, exactly. We already have too many Jokers with just the one, I would argue, in some cases. So I was gonna talk about this case of making a character worse, and I'm going to turn the tables a little bit. I'm not going to talk about Scarlet Witch, but I am going to talk about her sister, though. I'm going to talk about Polaris just a little bit because that is a case where this thing I said, where the retcon, if it makes a character better, if it gives them better stories, with Polaris, that is like abjectly not the case. It's like completely the opposite case. Her stories have gotten so much worse since that entire retcon happened, like unbelievably bad. And I think that's just a case where I don't know. It's so badly done, like that entire thing. It also sort of ties together with this Shiva thing we said. So, for those of you who are unaware, because nobody really cares about Polaris, she was introduced in a in an arc of the Silver Age X-Men comic, where she got told by Magneto that she was his daughter and that she had to serve him, and she was like, "Oh, I guess he's my dad. I guess I'm doing this now. I'm like an evil mutant now." And then in the very same arc, in the final issue of that arc, same creative team and everything, the X-Men were like, "Nope, like we checked your records and stuff like that. You're not actually Magneto's daughter." And she's like, "Phew, okay, phew, I'm off that hook." And then she went on to be like an X-Men supporting character for a long time, and she was in X Factor by Peter David, which is an excellent comic. And then in the 2000s, roughly around the time when this Lady Shiva origin retcon happened,
There was something in the air. There was something in the water back then.
roughly around the same time that the Wanda thing in Disassembled happened as well, they re-retconned Polaris back into being Magneto's biological daughter in a very strange and shoddy storyline where she was basically in Morrison's X-Men, Cassandra Nova bombed Genosha to shit, and it was like basically nuked. And that ended up disrupting the Earth's magnetic system, which made Polaris go crazy, like really, really crazy. And then Chuck Austen started writing her, and he made her into like a villain-ish, and after that, her arcs have tended to just be that she goes insane and becomes a villain again, and that's basically it.
What else do you need?
What else do you need, indeed? And it plays back into this thing that we talked about with Lady Shiva, like genetic evil. I hate that idea. I hate the idea that because she is, like, when she wasn't Magneto's daughter, she was okay most of the time. And then she gets retconned into being Magneto's daughter, and she immediately becomes a villain, like constantly. It's the same thing that they do with Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver as well. And it's like, you know that there isn't an evil gene, right? There especially shouldn't be, because Magneto didn't raise any of these three people. They only met him when they were adults, all of them. Like, that's literally Polaris's origin story, is that she's like in fucking college and Magneto comes up and like, "Yeah, I'm your real father." Like, she didn't grow up with him. Why would she go evil because she's related to him? And it's because she's got the evil gene, you know?
Yeah, you can't help it, man. You can't help it.
Just like Walt Disney.
Nature versus nurture, baby.
Yeah, exactly.
People who are, some people are just born evil and will stay evil forever, which is what we all learned from Jack Kirby's New Gods.
Exactly. Wait.
That was the final lesson of the Fourth World.
Oh yeah. Well, maybe we should talk about Tom King's Mr. Miracle and just get this going. No. But in the case with Polaris, I think she has honestly been treated worse by being connected to Magneto than Wanda has, because at least Wanda gets good moments in other stories, and she has sort of been on the way to recovery for a long while. But like, even the very, very latest comics published with Polaris and X Factor has had her be like crazy fanatic Magneto zealot character. And it's like, yeah, that's a good character right there. So her character was like turned immensely much worse by that entire retcon, which I think is the very definition of a bad retcon.
Yeah, it's when you tie a character too much to a bigger character, and suddenly that's all they are now. You are
Mhm.
now Magneto's other daughter, other less famous daughter.
The less popular daughter, and because of that as well, she doesn't really even get those stories where people like try to salvage her. Like, at least they've tried. You know, James Robinson did the Wanda solo series, which was uh, a good attempt and stuff like that, and the current series as well. But nobody really does that with Polaris because, as you say, she's the other daughter. Like, oh yeah, and then there's the other one, you know, the green one, the player 2 version. So yeah, you can definitely make a character worse with a retcon if everybody else just follows that retcon. Yeah. So, um, gentlemen, do you have any closing thoughts about retcons? Like, I think we discussed how, and why, and wherefore, why people do them, and why people use them. Do you have any closing thoughts about them, Elvis?
Well, I did have an example I wanted to bring up.
Oh, go
Do
ahead,
it.
please.
Right. So this is one I really hate. And it's always been bugging me because it's one of those things where like same creative team, same creators. So I don't know if it's like counts as a retcon per se, but it feels like one because of how the context is set up, and it's from Static. It's from Static, this original Static comic book series.
Oh, okay.
Right, right.
Milestone, all that, right? So there's this whole storyline with like Static getting his first girlfriend, and like they're going out, and it's like there's a big issue, big lead up to that big issue where like they're like kind of spilling up the fact that he's going to lose his virginity, that they're going to have sex for the first time, and it's nice, it's sweet, it's a fun little issue, it's a fun little story, and then like way at the end, like a couple arcs later, him and his girlfriend break up, and they make a very point to mention, right, that issue they didn't go through with it. Okay, so he's still a virgin. And then like and I feel like the reason they did that because this is the same time because his girlfriend at the time wasn't the love interest. You know what I mean? It's like the girlfriend that he was having at that time, and this is the girlfriend that he was trying to have like the first half of the series. It's not the love. Like if they made like a new comic book series right now, like starting from the beginning, you'd have Mary Jane as the side character. It's like Ultimates. Like where like Peter and Gwen Stacy know each other and have that little thing, but Mary Jane's kind of like in the periphery, that kind of thing. That's how the setup was kind of like. Like, well, he's going out with Gwen Stacy, but Mary Jane's right there. That's how it was set up. So like the girl he's going out with and had that big storyline was not the love interest, the love interest, the end game. So I feel like and I hate that then because when they break up, they make a point to mention they never got through with it. So he's still a virgin. And I feel like they did that specifically so that he would still be a virgin for when he got together with the actual love interest. And like that's so lame. That's cheesy. That's forced. It's not realistic. And in the early Milestone made a very big point of being realistic. It feels like, well, he gotta be pure for the true love interest, Like what? That is kind of really insulting.
Weird.
It's insulting.
It's so weird.
It is. It's like this is. I expected more from Milestone at that point, because like all that stuff, they really try to go really hard with a couple of things, like some really in-depth topics. But then like that felt so corny, like they gotta be virgins together, It's like it's lame. It's really lame.
Yeah.
You have to save yourself for marriage, like
exactly.
a good Christian boy.
It's very purity based. It's so weird.
Yes.
I always hate that retcon. Again, same creative teams. I don't know if it counts as a retcon, but I'm going to treat it as one because the context is so starkly contrast, And so I don't like that. But other stuff I don't mind. I mean, I like that Superboy is half Lex Luthor. I think that's good. And overall, I don't mind it because I think comics it's become such a fact of comics. It just kind of bleeds into like the background white noise, If you pay too much attention to it, you're just not paying attention to the story.
Exactly. I think it really we didn't talk about One More Day and since past here, but Yeah, that's also one of those cases where you don't really understand, I think, what the purpose is. It's like one of these stories that just happens to be a retcon. Like One More Day is obviously, it's just about the retcon, which is not usually good storytelling, to say the least. Not to mention the fact that that's really one of those cases where the following stories were not improved by this story. So you really just end up wondering what the fuck was up with it, and why and how. Judge, what do you think? Do you have any closing thoughts?
Pretty much what I already said is that if you're gonna retcon because you think it'll make the story better, not because you want to tell like a whole new story. Retcon because it's necessary in some cases, but otherwise I think like the best thing that you can do with most characters is to just focus on the future. It's
Mm,
just focus on what's a new story that I can tell with this character? What's a
yep.
whole new thing that I can do? Because I understand that in a lot of ways retcons are tempting because they're such an easy way to get attention. It's such an easy way, especially from the kind of people who really read superhero comics, like the whole everything you know about this is wrong,
Yeah.
or we're gonna do something that will forever change the way you look at this character, and we're gonna do it by changing this thing that has already been changed like 6 times before.
Mm,
And I get the temptation of doing that, but I still think that's like it's not something that you should go it shouldn't be your go-to idea for a news story, especially for a news story. Like if you want to tell a new story
mm.
with a character, tell a new story with your character. Don't just uh, change things in an old story. Or I can dig a little bit. I dig a little bit more telling an old story in a new world. I think that has value,
Mm,
and I think that's cool. And I know for a fact that that can result in a lot of things that are good. It can result in a lot of things that enhance the character and show why the character has been around for this long, and
mm.
they can help bring them back and bring them in for a new audience. Like I know a lot of people who say that Ultimate Spider-Man was the first comic that they followed a lot. So
Yep.
that kind of let me tell you an old story in a new environment that I can deal a lot more than let me change this old story. So yeah, I would say that's my closing thought on Redcon is that I understand why they're necessary, and I understand why they're tempting, and I understand that sometimes a lot of good stuff can come from them. But overall, I would much rather prefer people focused on telling new stories, and that should be it.
And I think it is that superhero comics have become so origin obsessed. Like, it's a common joke, of course, that whenever they do like a new set of Spider-Man movies, we're always going to have the first movie is going to be about the origin again, and like how are they going to do the origin that everybody already knows once more. And the comics have sort of become the same. I think there is this insecurity that you can't tell a superhero story without going back to the origin and maybe modifying, or as you say, reveal something shocking about it again. It's I don't know. I think it sort of comes from the huge success of stories like Year One back in the 80s, and there have been all of these very defining superhero origin stories, and I think people have just become a little bit too obsessed with that aspect of it instead of looking to the future, as you say. Um, and that's how you get into these bizarre situations like uh, where you're at with like Black Widow now, for example, where every Black Widow series for a while was just another new origin for her, or like new retcons to her origin, and more complexity heaped onto the already significant complexity from the previous series. And I don't
Hmm.
know why that behooves. I don't know how that makes the comic better. I don't know how it enhances the reading experience and at all. like the best Black Widow series that they released in recent years was the one where they didn't talk about her origin at all.
Yeah,
I think.
yeah, absolutely, and that was great. That was wonderful. That was like, yeah, this is what we need.
Was that Kelly Thompson
Yeah,
who did
that
that?
was Kelly
Yes, it was
Thompson
Kelly Thompson. Yes,
with Elena Casagrandes, and it was
yes,
fucking
I believe in
phenomenal.
Kelly. I believe in Kelly Thompson. I think she really does have a tendency to just move forward with characters instead of backwards. And since you mentioned this when you were talking as well, Judge, I think it's amazing that in all of these years, like Marvel has never retconned out the sexual assault of Carol Danvers from her origin, which is that's amazing because that story, Avengers 200. That's one of those rare cases when I feel that's a story that is so bad that you don't want it to be canon because like sexual assault is fucking nasty. Like, please don't
Yeah.
put this in your comic. And that's like it's amazing to me. They've never retconned that. Like even when they did this big, like the big one where they revealed that she was half Cree and everything, that didn't
Yeah.
change anything about that story. That still happened. And like the G. Willow Wilson run as well. No, sorry, Kelly Sue DeConnick run.
Right.
That also had that as it was still canon. She just forgot that it happened, which is not really good. Like it's not and so like that's one of those rare cases when I feel like this is something that you are totally validated, especially if you're a woman writing comics. This is something that I would not be bothered at all if you felt like you needed to go out and take a stand and say that this is not something that we're going to ever use again. Like this was nasty, this was a thing of the past, and that's something that they have never actually done. Amazing to me.
Yeah. It's my favorite way of retconning a thing is we're not gonna talk about that thing.
Yeah.
We're
But
just not gonna. We're going to pretend. We're not even gonna go into it. We're not gonna mention it except Bendis that one time to make a terrible joke about it.
Oh yeah, sure.
But it's like retcon by omission.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, sometimes it feels like the things that people get obsessed with retconning are things that are really not important and not something that makes things better. And then they leave other things and keep referencing other things that they should be ignoring or omitting or, soft retconning out or whatever. So sometimes I just don't know what goes through people's heads with these things, honestly. Oh, we didn't
Who can understand the twisted mind of a comic book writer?
We didn't even fucking talk about that Carol Danvers origin retcon where it turns out that she only became a hero because she had the good gene, like the hero gene. Like, my god, like this was a modern comic as well. This isn't like 30 years ago. This was like 10 years ago, I think, maximum. And they're like, no, she didn't. Like, she didn't become a hero because she accidentally gained powers and then decided to do something good with them, which is like usually kind of the Marvel attitude towards heroes. Like they're usually like they're people who get into something not quite by design and then they say, oh, I should probably do something good with my life. Like, Steve Rogers wants to do something good with his life. Peter Parker wants to do something good with his life, but then they go with Carol Danvers. Yeah, but like the reason that this happened is that her mother was like secretly this big Kree space hero who was like the one noble Kree between all of the asshole Kree. So Carol inherited her good half Kree powers. Like that's why she became a hero. She was destined to be it. And I'm like, huh. Was that really better? Was this better? How was this better?
Was this absolutely necessary?
Yeah. And a lot of people speculated that maybe they did that because they thought that the movies were going to do that. But then it turned out that the movies just went with her original origin sort of instead.
That is so fucking weird. I will never understand that. You are Marvel. You should be able to go to the movie people and tell them, "Hey, can you give us like a draft of the script so we can tell what the fuck is gonna happen?"
And don't guess about it. Like if you absolutely have to do that kind of thing, do it after the movie's out. Like
Yeah.
I promise you, it's gonna be better if you do it after the movie's out and you know what's gonna happen in it, instead of like doing it ahead of time and using some kind of vague rumor about what's possibly gonna
It's so
happen.
weird. They
And
should be able to just pick up the phone and just call Kevin and be like, "Hey, Kevin, got any plans for Carol Danvers?"
yeah, and like because there was also this Photon series about Monica Rambeau, which came out
Mm,
ahead of her appearance in the Marvels,
yeah.
where in that series they hint that she's a mutant, that she
Mm.
didn't actually get her powers from the experiment. She just sort of had them already, because you see her like, oh, I remember being in like my bed when I was a teenager and I could make lights with my hands and stuff like that. And people have speculated that that was probably based on some kind of early draft for the Marvels where it would sort of turn out that she's a mutant. Because if you've seen that movie, she ends up in the mutant universe in that one. But obviously, they don't actually say anything about her origin in that, so that miniseries just exists as this weird little thing in its own universe that nobody knows what the fuck to do with, because it's like it doesn't make sense with anything else. And it's also this case where they did something ahead of time because maybe they'll do this. Like, okay, sure, goody. Yep. So
So that's retcons, baby.
That's retcons, baby. There are so many retcons. When I prepped for this episode, I just started writing retcons down, and I have like 2 pages written down of just stuff. I think we covered like some of the more
Yeah.
interesting ones in order not to just start repeating ourselves as well.
Yeah.
So I think we should start tying things up here. What do you think, Elvis? Do you want to tie things up?
Yeah, no, I'm feeling like if we're all wrapping up, then I mean, there's really not much else to say other than our farewells. If you guys want to say your farewells, let us know.
Yep. Thank you very much for having me as usual. You can find me at Comrade Bullski on Blue Sky mostly, but also on Twitter or X or whatever, where I write about comics quite regularly. Recently published a major overview of the career of the very underrated Mark Gruenwald, one of the great Marvel creators of the 80s. Judge, where do we find you?
You can find me also on Blue Sky at Judge Anon. You can also find me on Tumblr, and yeah, I'm just mostly just posting about comics and games and stuff in general. Uh, so yeah, that's about it for me. Thank you very much for having me around, guys.
Thank you very much for having me.
No problem, and thank you so much to anyone who listened. See you again next time.
All
Catch you
right.
around, everyone.
Bye.